I call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting 121 of the House of Commons of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Bienvenue à la réunion.
Welcome to the meeting of the Standing Committee of Justice and Human Rights. The committee is meeting to undertake its study of C-270.
To begin its study of Bill C-270, an act to amend the Criminal Code, pornographic material. We are here in public to resume debate on the motion that had been put before us last time by MP James Maloney, requesting an extension of 30 sitting days to report Bill C-270 to the House. I would simply ask for each member to please wait to be acknowledged by the chair before intervening, and the clerk will assist me as well to keep a list of speakers. And now I will ask to resume debate on the motion that the committee request an extension of 30 sitting days to the period committee consideration for Bill C-270, because as you know, the expiry date will be the Tuesday after we return from Remembrance Day, and we need to get this extension in order to be able to study this bill in committee. So thank you very much for that. And we have a speaking order. And I will start with, so we will resume debate, and we will ask MP Couric to please begin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and it's always good to be back at the Justice Committee, and I know the important work that this committee does. And if I could just, without ceding my time, just wondering, Ms. Chair, if you could just share what the speaking list is, just so that we have a bit of an idea, and then I'll look forward to being able to have my intervention, but just wanting to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Sure, if everybody's okay with that, sure. The clerk has written down, and I'm just looking to my left here, because I was making my opening remarks. So MP Couric, MP Maloney, MP Biddle, MP Van Popta, MP Giovanni, MP Brock.
Thank you very much. And you know, it's important, the issues that this committee is studying, and in particular, you know, I've taken the opportunity since Bill C-270 was introduced in the House of Commons, and some of the context surrounding making sure that, especially some that the Canadians who are facing these incredibly vulnerable situations are protected, and there is nothing more devastating to someone and their ability to live a full life when explicit material, often without consent, or even if it was obtained through consent, but used in a manner that is entirely inappropriate, how that destroys people's lives. And I know that there is of course some of the headline-grabbing incidents that we can all point to, and I know that it's not uncommon that those headlines garner what is needed attention to this important issue. Although I would just, before getting into that, we are entering a space where, because of the advancements in technology, and I know I've worked with a number of my colleagues that are very in touch with this, but it's Bill C-270, of course, is dealing with the specifics around the material that has been created and distributed without consent. But the whole idea of deep fakes is something that is a growing concern, and of course, all of us around this table, being elected officials, having, I would imagine, we've attended election forums where we've had the chance to discuss at length important issues that our constituents bring forward. Some of those are you know, from I think back to the last couple of elections that I've had the opportunity to run in, but I further think back to the many hours I spent volunteering as a politico in rural Alberta and the various other places I've had the opportunity to be involved across Canada, and with cell phones and cameras everywhere, one assumes that everything now is being recorded. That's just kind of the assumption, or at least that's the attitude to which I've expected. And what is interesting is that in the world in which we live today, it is not simply a camera having recording something that speaks to something that happened with artificial intelligence and some of the technology, and of course animation, including very, very good animation. I know that occasionally you'll see reports of something that could be video games, and I know there's probably members, because I know that Canada has a booming video game industry, which is an augmented sort of allows for an augmented reality type circumstance. But we're entering a space where, while this confronts us as elected officials on a daily basis when it comes to the politics of the nation, that something could be attributed to you that you did not say, but nonetheless attributed to you. That there is somebody that may have a political agenda against you, that could have a video made that could look very, very realistic. In fact, it's something that I know my team, when these things happen to come, whether it's me or whether it's any other political figure that has something that is known as a deep fake, you report it to Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, whatever the case is. But I think that where there's the intersection with what we're talking about here is that that type of technology really has an impact on when a photo can be taken of an explicit nature, which may or may not have been obtained without consent, but certainly we've heard that it certainly was not taken for the purposes of distribution. With technological application, there is incredible damage that can be done to somebody's reputation of things that may or may not have actually happened, and especially when it comes to individuals who could be in a vulnerable situation where there's incredible emotions involved. There's quite often shame, and we've heard some of those tragic things. But my encouragement through you, Madam Chair, to the committee, this is an evolving space that is evolving very, very quickly. And as we look into some of the specifics surrounding Bill C-270, we have to be aware that the environment to which we are having these discussions is changing dramatically, and it is there is further risks. There's tools that I have no doubt within the justice system, and I know I'm just thinking of my colleague, Ms. Rumpel-Garner has done a lot of work on this, acknowledging some of the cross section, so to speak, of how this tech, along with people who are in a vulnerable situation, it can be absolutely destructive to someone's life, and just the importance of having frameworks and what is at this point, I think, in the conversation very much. We're the government, and this isn't simply because I'm a conservative and there's a liberal government, but I think that one of the things that quite often is the case is government, and especially areas of regarding criminal matters. It's often a game of catch up. We've seen this throughout history, so it's not new. But the pace at which the understanding of things like criminal prosecutions in relation to how technology is advancing at a breakneck speed, and then you add AI on top of that. And what's interesting is the conversation around AI. Of course, you can use ChatGPT. you'll hear news stories about that use in how do universities deal with it, and there's all of these things that happen. But I think that it's not well understood that the advancement of some of these technologies is not just the advancement of the technology itself, but the advancement and to the pace to which these technologies allow for advancement. And I think that's something that needs to be very, very much kept in mind. But I know for the circumstances of where vulnerable individuals face content that's being shared, quite often explicit, that it is the devastating consequences of that, and the speed to which it can be distributed is absolutely it can be devastating. So I'd started to say earlier how, when it comes to we hear the instances where that make headlines, and I would suggest that this committee, and I know many of those involved in this conversation, could point to those headline type instances where somebody's content was shared without consent. It made headlines. Sometimes it was stolen. I know that there's actors and movie stars that you will see a headline that something was stolen from their phone because of a hacker or whatever the case, and that's one thing. But for every headline, there are untold numbers of individuals that don't have a massive public following, that don't have the ability to call, a reporter at the New York Times or have a legal team to try and deal with these instances. And I would encourage the committee, especially surrounding the instances of where the devastating consequences that that can result from this. We have to be looking out for the proverbial little guy, because the team of lawyers, the ability to bring legal action and injunctions against a social media company or an individual is one thing, but when it is somebody who because of maybe a domestic challenge, or an abusive relationship, or something that was could have been released because of a simple password hack. There's a whole spectrum to what that could have looked like. It's not just the big instances here, and I know that when it comes to some of the circumstances that are faced here, they touch at some just incredibly vulnerable moments for these individuals, and the embarrassment that often comes along with that. And I know that there are instances where people are afraid to even bring it up because they just want it to go away. They're just hoping it goes away, or they don't want to make a bigger fuss out of it. And I know I've heard over the course of caring about this and making sure that these vulnerable Canadians in particular are protected. You hear some of just heart-wrenching instances where there is the process to which you are trying to deal with this embarrassing situation where your livelihood because of a job or damaged relationships, the whole myriad of consequences that could come out as a result. You are now in the situation where there is the processes that exist are not designed to help the victims, and in some cases add further challenges to the vulnerability that these individuals who are already in vulnerable circumstances are facing. And as a result, Madam Chair, it speaks to the need to ensure that we stop the internet sexual exploitation. We have numerous cases where we are seeing the specific examples of what this could look like, but we need to do more than just nail down a specific example. It's about making sure that there are consequences to these actions. So I would like to, if I could, Madam Chair, just share a couple of quotes that are I think, incredibly relevant to the conversation, and then I'll go into some of just the environment to which led us to this point where it seems like with impunity or without impunity rather that some of these bad actors are able to continue working. But there's a survivor of a 2014 cloud hack that an actress involved in media said about this particular bill. I support the Act. Canada's Parliament needs to urgently implement the Act, which would save many lives. Everyone deserves basic human rights, dignity, and a life without online exploitation. And this individual was has the real lived and life experience of facing her content being distributed without consent, and the consequences of that are life altering. And I think that especially for those of us in public life, we're used to being in the public eye. But for an individual who might, whether an actress or whether it's a college student that just got out of a relationship, whatever the case is, there has to be the exploitation can have on someone's life, and I can't not acknowledge that there are many instances where you have individuals that are led to that feel utterly hopeless, and as a result, even have tragically either tried or in some cases have taken their own lives. And again, just the devastating consequences to that, and the loss of an innocent life because their password was compromised. Maybe they shared an image with somebody that then got shared because somebody thought it was funny. It speaks to how there has to be accountability, and the whole idea of ensuring that that consent is ascertained. And let me talk just a little bit about why that is so important. And this my work on the ethics committee talks a lot about consent and releasing information and what that looks like, and just especially in this online world, I would suggest there's been a radical shift in the attitudes to which this has been understood over time. But what I think is clear, because certainly when it comes to material that people may or may not like that exists, it is important that the concept of consent is very, very clearly articulated. And the reason for that is because when it comes to consent, somebody can consent for, whether it's explicit material or otherwise, to have that consent ascertained and a process to which it is lawfully done, that then empowers that individual. And I know, speaking to some of my time at the ethics committee when dealing with in particular social media, but the idea of the right to be forgotten. It's a fascinating discussion, and it relates directly to these conversations, because where we have this intersection here is that the old adage is, and I would suggest is accurate, that there's once it's on the net, it never goes away. You can't get rid of it. And for some individuals within politics, they know that very well. But I would suggest that the idea of the right to be forgotten, what happens with your information, what that looks like in terms of the ability for you to be able to press delete, and what that means. For just of interest around this table, the Library of Congress in the United States sponsors what is called the Wayback Machine. And if you ever have a chance, just Google the Wayback Machine, and it is, and go to a website. So for example, you could pick a Canadian news website, say CTV News. And what is interesting is you put that news URL in the Wayback Machine, and you can go back, and the number of times that it has been the number of times that particular website has been archived, you can look back throughout the entire history of that URL having existed, and the content on which that was on that particular website as it was archived. Now, in some cases, and I'm sure I don't know the number of times that ctvnews.ca would be visited, but it triggers that sort of thing for these types of larger websites. And of course, we just of course there's a lot of political happenings happening in the United States this week, so it might be an interesting thing for anybody who would look back. You could go back to the 2000 election, the 2004 election, 2008 election, and these URLs that are common. CTV News, I mentioned. You could do CNN, you could do Fox News, you could do MSNBC, whatever the case is. You could look back and say, okay, well, at that day, that's what that website looked like. And it's fascinating because unlike a book where you have and in particular, the Library of Congress has this protocol. When a book is published, you send a book to the Library of Congress, although I don't think they keep every single book that is sent to them. There's this preservation of data. But the flip side of that, and the reason why it is so relevant to the discussion we're having here today, is because the flip side of this is that when something is put on the internet, it is very, very difficult to get rid of. So when it comes to archiving world events, I think nobody would suggest that there isn't a place to ensure that it can be accurately maintained, to ensure that when a public figure speaks, and all of us in this place, when we speak in the House of Commons, we deal with this very, very specifically in terms of what we all affectionately refer to as Hansard. And for those of us that reference a name or a date or something, and I know that there's a whole host of conversations taking place in the House related to SDTC and the Liberals Green Slush Fund, that is permanently preserved. And the neat thing about Hansard, and part of its value for democracy, is that when something is said in the House of Commons, it is there forever, and it can be referred to in time immemorial, and there's value to that. But at the same time, we have to ensure that when a bad actor takes information, something that is of somebody taking explicit material obtained or distributed without their consent, that there is clear parameters and an understanding, and to ensure that we have this what I would suggest needs to be attention. You have this permanence that exists on the internet. It has to be matched with an understanding that there are consequences when somebody is not willing to respect, is trying to harm. In many cases, I would suggest, and I know that it was absolutely shocking when it came to some of the conversations around C270 and the SISE Act. You have this there's a whole industry on revenge porn, and I look at that and say, like, how sick is it that is in fact the case? To ensure that there is a very clear mechanism, and I know the Act speaks very specifically about both the production of pornographic material and what that means for explicit, for just defining what that is without one's consent, and then of course the distribution of that that material, and how it's important to have those clear parameters, and in particular, and quite often, although not limited to, it is women, specifically vulnerable women, that face the biggest consequences in relation to these sorts of things. And it's not just me saying that. That's what the numbers. That's what the statistics show, that women are disproportionately affected by this. So to ensure that there are consequences for the individuals that would attempt to abuse, take advantage of, and for whatever other reason, whether it's money, whether it's power, whether it's leverage, whatever the case is, to ensure that there is a clear consequence and understanding of what those consequences are when it comes to the unauthorized, the non-consensual distribution of material that could have devastated consequences. So we are debating the specifics of a motion that would extend debate on this. And look, we have, I mentioned one, and I will read into the moment some more quotes that speak to why it's important that this gets reported back, that this gets done. And look, Conservatives have been very clear that we want a carbon tax election. But to be able to pass Bill C-270, and the fact that it was voted for unanimously in the House of Commons, I think is a good example of how, in the midst of what is a very, very political environment, that there is those moments where you can say, okay, we're doing what's best here. If we extend this, however, by 30 days, it not being reported back on what the original deadline is, it reduces the ability for, and certainly reduces the likelihood that this would become law. And the consequences of that relate back to what I've been talking about in terms of making sure that vulnerable Canadians that may be put in these circumstances are ultimately protected. That includes ensuring that those who are disproportionately affected, like women who are in vulnerable situations, that there is the clear consequences for this sort of thing. So we have to keep that in mind as we discuss these issues. So I would, Madam Chair, like to share as well a quote from the National Council of Women in Canada. The National Council of Women in Canada welcomes the proposed Bill SISE Act that calls for amendments to the Criminal Code to protect those whose rights are brutally ignored. Content acquired and shared without consent is unacceptable in a just society. And Madam Chair, I think that touches on a few things that I'd like to expand on just very, very briefly, if I could. And that is that the criminal code is meant to ensure that when it's what's often referred to as in philosophy as a social contract. Right, there are you give up something in order to ensure that something is protected, and that is the case here. As Canadians, we understand that the criminal code is that guiding principle that in particular Parliament has brought forward, and the history of that. In fact, it was John Sparrow Thompson, I believe Canada's fourth Prime Minister, when he was Justice Minister under Sir John A. Macdonald. A Catholic from the Maritimes, and at the time that was actually a big deal because Catholics, there was not, at that point in time, there was some controversy surrounding that, and I know that seems to be something hard to imagine, but certainly back in the late 1800s there was some controversy around that. But he, in his work as Justice Minister in the Macdonald government, brought forward what we now know as the Criminal Code of Canada. And much of, although it's been updated and language obviously has changed over the last century and a half, but there's this understanding that there is this backstop that ensures that for someone for their God-given rights to be protected, there has to be this backstop. that there's a threshold to which criminality is crossed, and that's, there's obvious answers here. We all believe that murder, things like homicide, is wrong, but the modern criminal code, and it's and I forget, I don't have the copy of the handbook criminal code with me here today, and I know it's hard to believe. That's maybe my colleague from the NDP does, but it's hundreds of pages, and the outline for what that means for civil society to be able to function in a way that ensures that rights are protected. So, as the National Council of Women in Canada have outlined, it's these individuals, their rights have been brutally ignored. And I think that speaks to why C-270 and its the ability to get it passed quickly is so important, because when you have, in this case, as we're talking about, internet sexual exploitation, the sharing of the non-consensual either creation, taking or sharing of this explicit content, you have a example where there is an actor, and there is somebody who is the consequence of and an actor not in the film sense of the word, but somebody who is taking an action that has devastating consequences for another individual. And the fact that this is we have the opportunity as Parliament to be able to very clearly broadcast that the clear consequences will exist, that there is a framework to which if somebody undertakes these actions, and then the protection that would ensure that those who are facing the consequences of these illegal actions, that there is that clarity. And further, the accountability, and I just want to mention this very, very briefly again, if I could, Madam Chair, the need to ensure that that there's consequences for the corporate actors involved as well, because I know that we're talking a lot about those who take and distribute the content, but just to ensure that there is a clear consequence for the corporate actors involved. And I know that Canada has played host to some of the worst corporate actors, I would suggest, in modern history when it comes to internet sexual exploitation. And I won't, because I don't want to give them credibility, I won't mention some of those companies, but it is astounding some of the ways that these companies have put Canadians, but also people around the world at risk because of the ways in which these companies conduct themselves, and ensuring. And I know my colleague from Kamloops was successful in seeing a bill brought forward that changes the name from child pornography to child exploitive material. And I think that's a simple signal to say, look, when it comes to this egregious stuff that exists, that it is not something that can happen within civil society. And that bill, I believe it just a number of months ago, actually received royal assent. So that's a good step and an acknowledgement that Canada is drawing a line here to say what is right and what is wrong. And when it comes to explicit material being shared, being created and shared without consent, we have before us the opportunity to again share that defining line to say, look, as a country, we are saying that this is wrong, and the signal that would send to corporate actors as well, that in some cases make billions of dollars off of sexual abuse material. And it is astounding. In fact, it was, and I don't have it in front of me, but I believe it was the New York Times did a overview of how this Canadian company was responsible for through it not doing its job, and it was a company that provides explicit material online. That was the objective of the company, but it was not doing its job to ensure that those who were featured on their website were that their consent had been obtained, and in some cases. Reading through this investigative report, it is absolutely horrifying to which the measures that were undertaken to, in some cases, bully or threaten or whether through financial means, whether through trying to use addiction, how that even when on occasion consent was obtained, it certainly wasn't done in a way that would stand up in a court of law. So again, we have before us the opportunity through Bill C-270 to put to draw a line here to say we have an expectation that there will be consequences, criminal consequences, for individuals and in the larger sense, corporate actors that would be guilty of putting these and just doing these absolutely egregious things. So further, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation had this to say, and this speaks to very well, I think, what I've just attempted to outline, and it is the quote: the pornography industry systematically fails to verify age or consent, leading to horrific trauma for survivors of sex trafficking, sexual abuse, and non-consensually shared recorded intimate images as their sexual exploitation is viewed around the world. It is time for a paradigm shift and for survivors to be heard. And the quote concludes by saying this bill is an important step in that direction. So as I've outlined, corporate actors here are not exempt from this. There has to be that understanding. That's where we're to come back to the idea of consent and what that looks like. I think that most Canadians will have, you download an app on your phone or a program on your computer, and before you're able to use it, there's a long legal explanation. And I think most of us have gotten pretty used to that, right? It's this long thing. So what do most of us do? We scroll to the bottom and press OK. Sometimes there's a checkbox, right? Now I know, although I am not a trained lawyer, and there are trained lawyers at the table here. Yeah, I share with classes that there's only 3 job requirements to be a politician. You have to be 18, you have to be a Canadian, and you have to get more votes, and that leads to a hodgepodge of individuals, some of which are lawyers, and I know I'm sitting at the table with lawyers. And while I've spent a lot of time looking at the law, I am a lawmaker, not a lawyer. But I think that to ensure that we have this understanding that the law is meant to, there has to be protection that exists. And when it comes to the ideas of consent and what that looks like, it looks different in different contexts, and obviously when it comes to the examples that we have that have led to where we're at with Bill C-270, but to just make sure as a society we have that understanding that it's about more than just scrolling to the bottom and pressing OK. It's about more than just having a contract given to somebody that your John Henry's expected at the bottom. There has to be that full understanding of what that looks like. And I know, again, to share some of just the overall perspective from what was heard from some of the reportings, and then I know and I believe it was the 42nd Parliament, there was a motion that where Parliament condemned. I believe, and I don't have the motion in front of me, but I believe the Parliament condemned violent pornographic material and the consequences that had on Canada, specifically for women and girls in vulnerable communities. But what is I think a devastating side of this is how, as we've seen some of these corporate actors that have simply failed to do their basic due diligence, and this is where the law, the criminal code, and I mentioned earlier John Sparrow Thompson, who had he wrote the criminal code 140 some years ago, and there's a lot that's changed in that period of time. From the telephone didn't exist, and newspapers were still made through putting lead presses together, and obviously things change, and we're in the environment today where a video can be taken, and in a matter of seconds, somebody's life can be destroyed. And I think that's where, to ensure that the criminal code reflects those realities, to ensure that there are consequences, that like when libel law was first kind of brought into being, the understanding that you couldn't just make unfounded remarks about somebody, there was that base understanding, and now we have, I think in Canada close to a century of case law that speaks to that. But we have here the rapid evolution where somebody, because they either made a mistake or have got themselves in a situation, and in many cases that they regret, and in some cases may have even shared with what was implied consent, but certainly not to the extent where it would have been meant. You have example after example after example where, and the many that we'll never hear about, because they're in, and I would suggest it probably includes our constituents, where there are those individuals that have faced these sort of circumstances, but they simply want that to be a past, and just to stay in the past. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to come to testify before a parliamentary committee. They don't want to have their name exposed because of the pain, the injustice, and in many cases the shame associated with that. And to speak further just about some of these bad actors, I would quote here from the London Abused Women's Centre. Companies like Pornhub and MindGeek are normalizing violence against women and girls. The actions of these companies do not protect women and girls from sexual exploitation, but the SISE Act can. We know that children, non-consenting adults, and trafficked women have been raped and tortured for the world to see on these websites. It is time for them to be held accountable for their actions. Parliament must protect those who are most vulnerable, and this Act provides important tools for them to accomplish this. And I would add as that emphasizes some of the discussions that I've shared around the corporate bad actors on this side of things, to ensure that there is those consequences, and especially when you have, in the case of these corporate actors, and I read them in the context of a quote, but made bank off of the abuse of, in particular, women. And it is absolutely, I would suggest, criminal. But the fact that they've been able to get away with it and is certainly something that demands action. And I know there's been a lot of conversation around online harms and whatnot, and I know the government brought forward a bill, and that's not what's being debated here. And I've certainly shared some of my opinions on that. But the need to take action to ensure that there are consequences, and to that those who are most vulnerable in our society are in fact protected. So that speaks to what is we're at a place, I would suggest, that is a little bit unique in our country, because we have seen a lot of the things that well, if I could digress just for a moment, because I think this has very, very clear relevance. When I came and I spent some time working in Ottawa, did an internship, spent some time when former Prime Minister Stephen Harper was in power. And while those were the good old days, and we can maybe get some common sense back to our country, nonetheless, it was a real honor to be able to spend some time. And at that point in time, my predecessor, the Honorable Kevin Sorensen, who I have a ton of respect for, was Minister of State Finance, and was able to help work on the last balanced budget that we had in this country, despite promises in the three subsequent elections that would be the case. Certainly, that has not been followed through. But my wife in particular, my wife Danielle, worked with as a volunteer for Joyce Smith, and Joyce Smith is a great story. So for those who I'm sure are watching, look up the story of Joyce Smith, because she is a stellar example of somebody who was not willing to just sit back and let injustices happen. And she has, and when she was first elected and was starting to raise awareness around the idea of human trafficking, it was a lot of people at that point in time said that doesn't happen in Canada. That just doesn't happen here. That was the response. She shares these stories about how she simply wasn't taken seriously. Yet she got involved in politics because of, and I'd encourage people to go read her story. I know there's some videos, like documentary type things, that speak about her history and her history on that issue. And she now runs a foundation, the Joyce Smith Foundation, that is continuing the work that she started when she was in Parliament. But my wife had the opportunity to volunteer for Mrs. Smith, and helped detail and track in some cases some of the just incredible injustices that had been done to Canadians, and yet that was in 2015 when Mrs. Smith started the journey of, and she had two private members' bills get passed, actually, which is impressive for all of us around the table who are in Parliament. To see two private members' bills passed in a career is an impressive accomplishment. But they were two private members' bills that were helping to ensure that there was action taken against human trafficking. And that directly relates to this because so often those who face themselves in these vulnerable situations are victims, or in some cases periphery victims that may be the trigger to which gets them in a situation where they could be a victim of something as horrific as human trafficking. And over the course of the Harper government, the acknowledgement that in a country like Canada, the amazing country that it is, with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Bill of Rights that preceded that, and the understanding that we care about the most vulnerable and all these things, you had just these egregious actions were taking place in many cases in the very communities and in some cases the neighborhoods to which people would say was the Canadian dream. And for those individuals, it would be anything but. For those who are facing human trafficking and for those and some of the consequences of this, actually, and I know for those of us, myself being an Alberta MP, I spend a lot of time in airports, flying across the country on a weekly basis. You actually see now that there's human trafficking awareness that's been done. Posters in bathrooms, for example, saying if you're a victim, reach out so that you can get help. And it may seem strange. Because it's become somewhat normalized that we're able to talk about that today. Well, that started because there was an effort to ensure that something that had previously been happening in the shadows, that it was brought to light and that it could be combated. And it's not to say that there wasn't good work. I know law enforcement, and again, if you look at the case, if you look at Mrs. Smith's work, she talks about how I believe it was her son was involved in in police operations to help ensure that victims of human trafficking were caught and the perpetrators were prosecuted and whatnot before it had garnered national attention. And so for her, it was something that she had seen and had experienced by walking alongside some of those victims, and yet it wasn't something that was on the national radar. And over the course of the Harper government, and I would suggest just the awareness that has resulted in, as a result of that, she saw 2 private members' bills passed and a significant step in the right direction. So then there are some stats that I might get into later, that how despite the work that has been done, there are some trends that are certainly not encouraging in terms of human trafficking and what those numbers show in terms of Canada today. I would, however, like to link this back to Bill C-270, because it speaks to how that issue and a very specific part of it, and I think I signed up for Twitter. I think I had looked at it the other week. It was I think 2009 was the date. I think Facebook just became a thing, and maybe the year before that, 2008. So these were new technologies. The access to the World Wide Web, while the web existed since, I think the first email was sent in 1993 or 1992. Something like that. So over the course of 30 or so years, we've seen a rapid evolution of technology that what would have been in the case of distributing explicit material that was obtained without consent or taken without consent, that would have looked very, very different 30 years ago. Yet we are in a circumstance today where it has a very it can take on a life of its own because of things like the internet and algorithms and the ability for things like a video to be shared, a link to be texted, and all of that type of thing. So the organization Defend Dignity, when talking about the Stopping Internet Sexual Exploitation Act, has this to say. Individuals who have been victimized are faced with the overwhelming task of trying to remove illegal content that should never have been distributed and profited from in the first place. It is time for pornography websites to be held accountable. Content should not be hosted without proof that all individuals depicted are adults and have consented to both the creation and distribution of the material on that platform. We give full support to the Stopping Internet Sexual Exploitation Act. And again, that's from the organization Defend Dignity. And I think, again, it speaks to that intersection where you need to be able to hold the individuals responsible while also ensuring that those corporate actors and I also was proud to support the Bill S-210, where it speaks to about some meaningful age verification, and I know the Liberals have tried to share some misinformation about that, which I'm a little bit confused about, because it's, even though some of their members initially had voted in favor of that, and I know that bill, the work that had been done to try and ensure that while respecting Canadians' rights, it also would ensure that in the case of that, you would stop what has been very clearly shown through studies and through work that has been done. When children are exposed to explicit content, it can have a detrimental effect on their mental health. So I'm a little bit confused as to why the Liberals have tried to politicize that particular issue, but I'd be happy to maybe hear from them at some point on that matter, because certainly I think that that seems like a common sense, something similar to what we're discussing here today, and again would be an expectation that those corporate actors, that there would be accountability to ensure that they are not. And it's a little bit like, it's illegal to sell cigarettes to a minor because nicotine is addictive, right? And it's not good for you. It has devastating health impacts. And while personally, and I know there may be smokers in the room, I don't smoke, and I think that it's a bad habit. But if somebody chooses to do that, well, that I guess that's their right to do so, and I can respect that. But we have rules and an understanding in our society that you can't have a tobacco company target, which they can't advertise in Canada, period, any longer. But you can't be targeting advertisements towards young people because they're not able to make the judgment call that is required to be able to deal with the addictive properties of nicotine and the health impacts, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to accessing something that could have devastating impacts on mental health, it can very much change the perspective of what healthy relationships are and should be. It just makes sense that there would be that meaningful age verification that doesn't say that if somebody wants to access explicit material, as much as someone may disagree with that as a life choice, to ensure that they that their rights are protected. But young people like being able to, I mentioned smoking and buying tobacco products, but it's the same thing with other things. It's the same thing with alcohol. It's the same thing with cannabis. You don't sell that stuff to minors because minors aren't equipped to be able to make decisions related to that. So I think that it is one of those things where just because it's online doesn't mean that. And in fact, I would suggest not to go too much down this, although I would suggest it has a pretty clear correlation with what we're discussing here today, especially in the timeliness and being able to pass it and the overlapping relevance of the two issues. But there is online gambling allowed in Canada now, but it is illegal for somebody who is underage to participate in online gambling. Yet it is not illegal for them to access explicit material that would otherwise be illegal for them to access. For example, if they were to go into a convenience store and want to purchase that sort of content there. So, but with that, I would suggest that these overlapping issues, while closely connected, it speaks to the heart of which there's a suite of changes that can be made to ensure that there is consequences for actors that would perpetrate actions, whether that be from the corporate side, not doing the ensuring that there's consent for explicit material that is uploaded, or whether that be for the individuals themselves, to ensure that that clear line in the sand is drawn accordingly. The Vancouver Collective Against Sexual Exploitation, when talking about this bill, has this to say. As a nonpartisan collective of diverse individuals, survivors, and organizations working together to end all forms of sexual exploitation, VCASE strongly supports Bill C-270. Canadians, especially the young and vulnerable, urgently need this protection. We urge all members of Parliament to support this bill. Well, Madam Chair, the good news is that in the second reading vote, and for those watching, just to explain a little bit, because it's always a little bit confusing, I think, because people hear things like first reading, second reading, et cetera. But the first reading is when a bill is introduced. The second reading is when it comes to a private member's bill, it's had the opportunity to be debated within a private member's framework, which is guaranteed and awarded via lottery in terms of the order to which something can be introduced. I've introduced a bill myself, Bill C-407. I'm not close on the order, and likely in a parliament like this, we're not going to we're not going to get to my bill being debated. It's the national the national symbol for a livestock brand in Canada. So very unrelated to this, so I won't talk about that bill here today for fear that I'd be point of ordered. But look forward to I'd be happy to send you information offline. It's a great way to share our Western heritage and frontier heritage in our country. But the second reading is generally the first opportunity that MPs have to vote on an issue. And while it's called the second reading, it's as soon as the second reading, which is the debate, first step of the debate process, is when that ends. That triggers a vote. Now, it's different for private members' business versus government business, but follows a similar pattern. But the neat thing, and it relates to what the case has asked for here, is because they've specifically said, look, they're nonpartisan, and they want a nonpartisan approach to support Bill C-270. And I have some good news on that front. There was, I believe, unanimous support for 270 at that second reading stage. So the first opportunity for a vote to take place in the House of Commons, and then if it passes, if any bill passes the second reading vote, it then is referred to a committee because it's a bill related to criminal matters. Of course, the rightful place was for it to come to the Justice Committee, of which I'm so thankful for the opportunity to be able to join you here today to discuss it. And then when it comes to private members' business, and this is quite different, legislation takes precedence of committee time. Committees are generally, they decide themselves what they want to study, but when it comes to House references, it takes on a little bit of a different flavor, because the House references that a bill, or it could be a motion, in fact, at the Heritage Committee through kind of a bizarre set of circumstances, the Liberals actually condemned and sent back a study to committee that condemns the paying of $18 million in bonuses to CBC executives. But I digress on that because, again, that's not related to the subject here. But it was a bizarre set of circumstances, so of course glad to have the opportunity to deal with that at Heritage. But there's was a change made when it comes to the specifics around how a committee can deal with private members' business. And this is important because a government bill and the reference of a bill to committee, when it's a government bill, you have the weight of the government behind it to ensure that that bill is studied and passed. And it can be incredibly complex. You have something like an omnibus budget bill, despite the Liberals saying that they've never put omnibus bills forward. They still seem to end up before various committees. But it can take a long time. You have a lot of different aspects. You have witnesses. You have discussion, and when there's controversy, it can take a very long time. And we saw this, for example, when it came to Bill C-21. The Conservatives brought forward a whole host of issues, and there was an outcry from across the country when it comes, whether it's Indigenous groups or others, when it comes to how the Liberals were approaching the issue of firearms. But what was I think it's important to note here is that private members' business, there was a tendency previously, and this was not unique to the Canadian Parliament. Our Westminster system of governance has there's quite a few Westminster-style parliaments. Of course, we reference, in fact, the opening lines of the Constitution and Act of 1867, known previously as the British North America Act, is that we will have a parliament similar in structure to that of the United Kingdom. Don't quote me on the exact, but that's very close to what it says. And that is that in the United Kingdom there is a House of Commons, and in their case they have a House of Lords, which are peers, which include the dukes and duchesses, etc., while also bishops and peers that are appointed for various reasons, whether that be through family peerages or appointments because of people who have done notable things. And I know I've had the opportunity to visit, and it's very interesting. I think there's about 900 lords, but generally they only have about 100 that are there, and they're only paid when they show up, interestingly. So maybe that's something we could take into account when it comes to how we pay our senators. But it's similar in terms of the structure to the Westminster style, where you have a bicameral legislature. But what has been noted, not just in Canada, but at different points in time, is that when there is a bill that passes despite opposition, generally from the government, although I don't think it has to be limited to that. There could be a specific actor or person that has influence. It could go in, and what we would suggest would just die at committee. That's kind of was a tendency for private members' bills. If the government didn't like it, they could say, oh, well, it can just die at committee. They just wouldn't study it. It's interesting, though, because changes were made to the standing orders, which for those watching, standing orders are basically the rules to which, whether it's a committee or the House itself, the House of Commons governs itself. So it's called a standing order. And it's a fairly thick book of all the different standing orders, and it's stuff that makes a lot of sense that nobody disagrees with, and then there's stuff that can be more controversial. Interestingly, generally standing orders were agreed to by consent of all parties. The Liberals, however, broke that trend and actually imposed votes with changes to the standing orders that were not universally agreed to by members of Parliament. But when it comes to private members' business, there was this history of bills that they didn't like going to committee to die, and that was noted by all parties because a member of Parliament, being the highest elected office in the land, which is an interesting thing, right? I think a lot of people forget, especially, I couldn't believe it. What must have been, I noted that CBC spent a lot of time covering the American election as of late, which Canadian tax dollars going to cover the American election I thought was interesting. But nonetheless, you have the members of Parliament are given a level of autonomy, as should be the case, right? It's a very very specific. Being an MP, it's this unique office that is held. You occupy a seat in the House of Commons, the same as, interestingly, the Prime Minister. And in fact, when I speak to classes, I ask them, how many votes on election day does the Prime Minister get to cast? Does the Leader of the Opposition get to cast? And it's always interesting because it's a confusing question, right? Because it's almost too easy. Well, they get to cast one. And likewise, I ask how many seats the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition gets in Parliament. And likewise, it's almost confusing in its simplicity, but it's like, well, you get one, and that's the strength of what I would suggest, the strength of the Westminster democratic system, and why I'm so vocal in its support. But the ability for MPs to be able to bring forward a private member's bill, like we have before us with C-270, we have the ability for an MP to do so. But when, because somebody didn't like what they had to say, but it passed anyways, yet it would go to committee to quote unquote die. And what is an interesting anecdote to that is it was seen to be, and not just by those who face those circumstances, but it was seen to be a scenario where it was removing the rights of members to be to be able to actually exercise their duties as a duly elected member. And in the unique circumstances when something might have been supported and then sent to committee and it wasn't able to move forward. So there was what I would suggest is a creative, and quite frankly, I support it. The ability for there to be an automatic reporting mechanism for private members' bills, which is where we have this here today. The government is trying to extend the study of this bill when we have clear unanimous support. Yet for various reasons, they are saying, well, we need to delay it. And the committee can do that. That's a mechanism within the standing orders. It gives them the ability to delay the reporting back to the House. But we could have been seized with this and had the opportunity to deal with this before. But the key here is that we need to get it back to the House. And that will happen, as the chair very, very aptly noted at the beginning. That will happen here in just a week or so. So the reason why these mechanisms exist is an important, I would suggest, evolution is the right term, to our democratic system to ensure that in the case of members and this unique ability we have through what is a private member's bill, which any member can, as I mentioned before. I have introduced one, although it likely won't be debated, and that's by nature. There had to be a fair way to figure out who gets to go first, so to speak, and the way that was chosen to be, and I don't actually know the history. It'd be an interesting thing, I'm sure, to look into, but it's done by pulling names out of a hat. So it's kind of an archaic way, but at least you know it's fair. The people who get picked to go first, it's done through a way that is very straightforward, fair, and is without bias. And to note, I believe it is government ministers and the Prime Minister are not. They do not get a private member's bill because of the nature of of their position and the influence to which they hold. So we are in a circumstance here today where we had a bill, Bill C-270, an act to amend the criminal code, the Stopping Internet Sexual Exploitation Act, before us, supported by all members of Parliament, which is, again, that's a great show of nonpartisan support, the ability for on occasion to ensure that, and I would just note, because I think that quite often the headline-grabbing stuff that comes from this place is the controversy, and rightfully so. And trust me, I'm happy to talk about controversy. In fact, I look forward to being able to continue in the discussion and on the Green Slush Fund that's taking place in the House of Commons and the controversy associated with that. And it's now more than a month that Parliament's been paralyzed by the government's refusal to release these documents, which they could do at any point in time. But I digress on that. Look forward to litigating that in the House. But here you have an example of where MPs agree on something. And I wish just on occasion that a headline would show that MPs agree on, in this case, fighting internet sexual exploitation. Wouldn't that be a great headline? A showcase of being able to say, look, MPs agree that some of the most vulnerable in our society need to be protected. And that's where, when I referenced the quote from the Vancouver Collective Against Sexual Exploitation, they called on all MPs to support this bill, and they're doing so from the perspective of being a nonpartisan organization. And that is something I think that is a we can't understate how yes please how there are these moments where you have that cross-partisan collaboration and the unanimous support of something like this bill, I think, is a huge opportunity. And then with some of the history that I outlined when it comes to the reporting requirements, we don't want this bill to die in committee. It would certainly be a shame for this bill to not go forward because of the proposed 30-day extension. Let's get back. We agree with it, and getting unanimous support on anything is something that is certainly very impressive, and I think speaks to how we can accomplish an objective here, and that is protect people that otherwise don't have the legal protections at this point in time, but have faced unbelievable circumstances that could be life-changing, and in many cases, because I've read some of the testimony and the stories, and truly have had life-devastating circumstances related to the non-consensual sharing of their material. Thanks very much, Larry. I would as well I'd like to speak, and we all know the Salvation Army. I'm sure there'd be very few of us across the country that would not have a Salvation Army in their constituency in one form or another. I know the work that they do in terms of helping the most vulnerable, whether it be through addictions recovery, whether it be through ensuring that the most vulnerable are supported, whether it be through their church and spiritual care. I know I've spoken to so many, and the work that the Salvation Army does, and are driven by that true love that it's talked about throughout the Bible, that just desire to see our community, see people serve, that whole idea of the greatest commandment, love God, love people. And the Salvation Army certainly does that incredibly well. But I would quote what they have to say about Bill C-270. It says this: the Salvation Army has worked closely over the years with people who have experienced or survived sexual exploitation. We know that their voices and wishes are rarely heard or respected. The Stopping Internet Sexual Exploitation Act is an important step towards establishing safeguards to protect adults and minors from having unwanted images of them posted and shared over the internet for commercial gain at their expense. And I do just want to ensure that it's understood a side of the conversation here that I don't think is as well, because we talk about some of the headline grabbing issues and whatnot, but part of what C-270, and this was highlighted in particular the New York Times report that talked about how some of the studios that are as a business model produce explicit content. And while that, I would suggest, is probably not a comfortable subject for many people to talk about, the abuses that would often take place, and it was just kind of seen that, okay, well, that happens over there, so we'll just let them do that. That's those people making those choices. But what was learned over the course of some of that study, and I know we've had that before various committees before this Parliament, we see how it's not as simple as that. These are not studios that that have actors coming in good faith to do to create this sort of content. It, in many cases, has a close connection to human trafficking. It has a close connection to sexual exploitation. And when it comes to, in many cases, there's a corporate structure that ends up complicating the ability for accountability to take place. So it's not just a cameraman and a producer and whatever is required to create that sort of content, but the legal complications associated with that have inhibited even some individuals within these sectors that may have initially consented to create certain material. They end up being in a circumstance where they are not paid, not given the monetary promises that they initially were made. And certainly when it comes to not honoring a contract, but then because of the legal complexities associated with some of that, and because of the legal ambiguity onto which exists with the sharing of that information, if this was the case in any other sector, if it was, a Hollywood-type television movie, so there is a whole legal, again, a whole bunch of copyright case law associated with that content, that and how it gets protected. There is clear protections that exist. Yet when it comes to somebody who may have, in good faith, decided to enter into a contract, yet they're not being paid for the work that they did, that is wrong. And I think that it is another example where you have to create clear criminal consequences for an instance where you see an abuse take place. And in that case, the abuse may not have been in the initial stages, but it certainly would be the case later on when a contract was not being honored. And at this point in time, it has become incredibly difficult and for these individuals to be able to get compensation, even though the companies to which are hosting their content are making, in some cases, billions of dollars, because it is an absolutely massive industry. So again, you have what, and in some cases we hear how promises were made by these recruiters and these producers, whatever the case is, and they were not kept to begin with, but they were told that don't worry, you'll get paid, and then they end up not getting paid, and it then contributed to a downward cycle in these individuals' lives. And again, this disproportionately seems to affect women, and how they were taken advantage of in the beginning and told that they would be compensated, but then they ended up not. And certainly when it comes to the need for some, again, a line to be drawn, that Canada is not a place where we allow this sort of thing to happen. So and two, I think that and in particular, I will reference this because of the context to which we find ourselves speaking in relation to the Salvation Army, and I know that the work they do in terms of shelters and addictions recovery, there's a lot of good work that's done there, but so often we see that whether that's somebody because of the revenge of an ex, or whether that be a circumstance when it comes to a big or a contract that was signed with a big company where they were promised to get paid but ended up not. You have these two very, very different sides of a similar cycle of exploitation that exists. You have individuals that end up being the victims, and what can, in many cases, become a difficult circumstance to which to overcome. In many cases, we hear stories of how their drugs and alcohol fuel much of the recruitment, and that's where, in some cases, that if you call them actors, they are recruited from, and then a cycle of addiction happens, and on it goes. So you have a circumstance where a cycle of abuse, it started, and then it has continued and can, in many cases, have absolutely devastating consequences. And then, too, to pull this back to the and make the connection with how this is directly and has a direct correlation with human trafficking. It is and what is, and I just for the benefit of those who are watching, and I'm very proud of the work that many of my colleagues. I mentioned Joy Smith, although I didn't overlap. She chose not to run again in 2015. But many of my colleagues have done incredible work. And there is another example of where there's been cross-partisan cooperation in that regard to help combat things like human trafficking. But quite often, I think that that people need to acknowledge that human trafficking is not somebody being, put in handcuffs and thrown in the back of a van. It can be somebody who you walk beside in an airport, who is dressed in nice clothes. It can be somebody who is not handcuffed by a physical means, but handcuffed by a video of them doing something that's compromising, by addiction, by mental health challenges, by a whole series of other things. And I think that one of the keys here, and why 270 is so important to this larger conversation, is because it provides a very clear framework to say, in Canada, this is not okay. And there's more work that needs to be done to combat human trafficking. And I know I'd mentioned earlier some of the startling statistics in terms of how that has been growing. We have the opportunity to see in short order, without an extension to the debate, a bill that was supported by everybody, to be able to say, okay, here is how we actually get some of this stuff done. Take action, ensure that there are consequences to the egregious acts of a few that are devastating so many. I would, Madam Chair, like to share another quote in support of this bill from an organization called Survivor Safety Matters. And the quote goes as follows: Survivor Safety Matters believes that every person should have the right to protect their privacy and have control over their personal information and images. We support the SISE Act and the requirement for informed consent to be obtained before pornographic images of an individual can be shared with anyone. It is no secret that women and girls are routinely degraded and exploited online through the unauthorized sharing of their private and personal images. This causes lasting harm to the individual that often cannot be undone. Madam Chair, it is just to highlight the last sentence there that said, and I'll read it again. This causes lasting harm to the individual that often cannot be undone. And I think that we have here again where there's the headline grabbing tragedies, headline grabbing circumstances where it could be a movie star that has images that are shared without their consent. And of course that's wrong and needs to be condemned. You have the tragedies that exist, and I know there's a whole host of examples where whether it makes it out of more than just regional media, but then to think of the number of people that suffer in quiet shame, to suffer in silence. It is, and my hope is that part of the discussion surrounding this bill would ensure that even if there is not that those individuals probably don't want to come and testify, share their story before a parliamentary committee because of some of the shame and embarrassment and fear for the damage that it could have to their professional reputation, their personal reputation, whatever the case is. But to ensure that we acknowledge the harm that can't be undone when somebody in the violation for an individual, and disproportionately this does affect women. The statistics show that very clearly, although it certainly is not limited to women and vulnerable peoples. And it's the sort of thing where you may have differences in the type of response based on where you come from and how much money your family has, or whatever the case is. There'd be a difference maybe in the type of response, but it's the sort of thing where it's not going to be. This is not a crime that simply happens to people without money or people with money. This is something that can affect anyone, and again, disproportionately women, although not limited to. And so when we can have the opportunity to provide clear definitions surrounding this, to ensure that we have a ability to stand up for those who are most vulnerable, and to ensure that there is the space within our justice system, the parameters that are needed within our criminal code to be able to say, okay, here is what is not allowed, and ensuring that both the individuals involved, but also the bad corporate actors, that they would be held to account. And I do want to, if I could, and I know my colleague from that I served on the ethics committee with, and despite having significant political differences, there was times where we would find agreement when it comes to things like consent and the right to be forgotten and whatnot. I touched a little bit on that earlier. But I think that the idea of consent and the meaningful nature of that is something that is important. And I'll use an example. A thief robbing a convenience store with a gun, asking the person behind the counter to hand over the cash from the register, and that person hands over the cash. Is that consent? Well, I think anybody would say, well, absolutely not. There's nothing consensual about that. Well, you could say, well, the action of that individual handing over the cash, that must imply consent, or that must say that they did it willingly. And yet you have a very clear instance and an extreme example that people would say, well, it's just common sense. It's the person guilty of the crime here is the individual that was pointing the gun or the knife at the clerk behind the counter, and that there's nothing consensual about that interaction. That you wouldn't want to call it a relationship, but it's certainly an interaction between a thief and a worker that was being robbed. And I think that it's that context that I would encourage those who are watching to consider when it comes to explicit content that might have been taken. You do not have a consensual type of circumstance always that exists when it comes to the information that or the content. So you may have obtained it in a way that was questionable, but you'd be able to point back and say, oh well, there was consent. Well, that's especially when it comes to vulnerable individuals, or even if somebody may not be in a vulnerable life situation, it could have been a vulnerable instance in their life. And to ensure that there is that very clear protection that exists, and just to ensure that the idea of consent is very clearly articulated, which is why in this bill it talks about how, and this in particular is so important when it comes to the corporate actor side of things, but it needs to have that clarity. And the word that stands out, and I won't read the entire definition, but it does say that it is a voluntary agreement. It has to be voluntary. It's not something that can be forced. Like, to use the example of the clerk and the thief, that's not a voluntary arrangement, nor are so many of the circumstances where consent might be suggested, or when it comes to addiction, or when it comes to some of the circumstances related to human trafficking, when some of this content seems to be often created, et cetera, et cetera. So that to emphasize the need for consent and that ability to consent to something, it hinges upon the understanding that there has to be a voluntary nature to that arrangement. And then if somebody is making a voluntary agreement, giving consent, well, then that is something that is then able to, when it comes to explicit content, and while one might not like that or disagree with that on a personal side of things, if you are giving that voluntary consent, well, then that is something that then there is that ability for that content to be distributed. But without that, the crux is it has to be that voluntary consent, and we see too many examples, Madam Chair, where that is simply not the case. And I would suggest we mentioned a little bit before just how when it comes to survivors, there are a lot of individuals that suffer in silence, and the devastating impact that this has on mental health, and how that can fuel addiction and other challenges. But I would just suggest that we have a clear understanding that this sort of thing, whether it's something that has been shared online and you hear some stories of where somebody made some content, or and either initially didn't realize what they were doing, were forced into it, or in relation to addiction, whatever the case is, or when it comes to more of the revenge side of things. But you have these instances where that hangs over an individual for the rest of their life. It is something that has a deep impact on mental health. You have throughout the rest of their life the possibility that the person that they're walking down, in fact, it was a very, very poignant survivor story that I had read, where it talked about they had just come from, and I this was when the last time I had looked at this was in the last Parliament, when we were discussing some of these issues at the Ethics Committee. So you'll forgive me for not having the story exact, but it was something along the lines of this young lady had just shared her story about being involved in human trafficking and getting out of that, and then some of the content that she had never been paid for and had tried to have removed, and all of the terrible story, heart-wrenching story that existed between what was, and she called it, a mistake that she had made early in her life. And then coming out of this testimony, she was in an elevator, and somebody recognized her from the content that she had been fighting so hard to see removed from some of these popular websites that were continuing to distribute the very material. And it was that for her, and it was a story that that she had then shared after the fact, and I had read this how devastating it was for her to be trying to combat it, yet even in the midst of trying to combat these circumstances, you had an example of where somebody in an elevator had then pointed out exactly the thing that she was trying to address. And that's where, when you create clear parameters around what consent is, ensuring that the distribution that both the making of this explicit material or the distribution of it, that there is clarity when it comes to this in the context of there being accountability, so that these actors, whether it be an individual or a company, that they are held accountable. And when it comes to, and I have a few more quotes that I'd like to get to, but just to speak to there being, there's a whole host of circumstances around that, and one of the reasons why I appreciate Bill C-270, and again, the need for it to get back to the House to be voted on to be debated and voted on at third reading, and if the government would just hand over those documents, we could get back to private members' business there. But again, I don't want to distract from the 270 conversation, but although it seems that there's an increasingly close connection. But one of the things that is I think helpful for folks to understand about this bill is it does ensure that the context surrounding the individual, excuse me, the instance of the content that might be distributed, created or distributed. There's those two pieces to this, and that's why they're connected, although very different in terms of the instance. You have a host of issues that in 270, and this is not always common when it comes to private members' bills. So I appreciate the work that my colleague had put into ensuring that this is comprehensive, that there is a full understanding of everything associated with what is required to ensure that that the line in the sand, so to speak, in Canada can be drawn. So it talks about what the punishment is, and including that the different types of offenses and what those sentences could be. The evidence and what the commercial purposes surrounding some of this information is, and the issue surrounding age verification. And I had referenced earlier just how significant it was as a symbol that we've changed the name so that it's child exploitive material in this country. It's no longer something that anybody could suggest is anything other than disgusting, criminal, exploitive material when children are involved in this sort of thing, which surrounds the idea of age verification. Because if it's not, there's that age verification side of things, and obviously if it's someone who is underage, then that goes into an entirely different set of and what I would suggest, I hope that every time that happens, the book can be thrown at those individuals and they go exactly where they belong. But when it comes to the aggravating factors, it talks around the bill very specifically outlines of that, and that there is an understanding of questions surrounding, and because there's this rapidly evolving space, there is both the needed clarity, but also the understanding that in this bill, this is an evolving space. The technology to which we are dealing with is evolving at a pace that I would suggest it is hard to keep up with, and the fact that we have it is certainly moving faster than any of us can comprehend, I would suggest. And I had mentioned that a little bit earlier when it comes to some of the periphery challenges that exist and some of the work that one of my colleagues is doing surrounding deep fakes and artificial intelligence, and including what victimization means. Because, and I know my my colleague from Langley Eldergrove and I have talked about this in the past, but the idea of victimization changes when all of a sudden you have the ability for a computer to start creating content that could be based on things that are not that but are changing things, and it could be explicit material that doesn't necessarily have a victim. And I know there's some complications around just a lack of examples, both in case law and our legal frameworks in this country don't necessarily have a clear answer for what that is and what that should look like, especially when we have, in our case, 150 some years of legal precedent that is based on victimization versus other factors that we have to be willing to come and address this. And I was disappointed that when the Liberals introduced Bill C-63, they didn't address that stuff. They certainly did bring forward some things that would silence that could be weaponized against some things like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but they didn't actually address some of the real challenges, I would suggest, that we are facing when it comes to the idea surrounding online harms, of which this bill really gets to the crux of the matter. And it talks about what the maker of and a distributor. There's some specifics surrounding that, about what that looks like. And then, of course, this is a interesting dynamic that does exist when it comes to the issues surrounding this particular bill is, and just for those watching in particular, I'll explain this just very, very briefly. Quite often what happens is a bill, in fact, in all instances, we have, I talked a little bit about the Westminster parliamentary process before, and how it is unique in the sense of members and the autonomy that members have. And just a shout out, I suspect that there's some Liberal members that wishes that they'd have voted for the Reform Act at their first caucus meeting, but I don't want to get distracted here. But one of the things that is key, and it's parliamentary supremacy in our governmental system that is so fundamental in how we do things. I think it's sometimes undervalued in terms of the true impact and importance that has in the way that we do things. Now, we have, and it's evolved over time, which, for example, we have a constitutional framework in this country, whether it be the Constitution Act of 1867, 1982, and there's actually a whole bunch of other Constitution Acts that are related to small changes that have been made, the admissions of provinces into the Federation, the creation of territories. In fact, there was we voted on one. My colleague from Regina Louvain amended the Constitution through a motion in the House of Commons in relation to a archaic tax issue related to dating back, I think, 140 some years. He had amended that. So the Constitution has an amending formula, and there's a whole host of acts surrounding that. But what's unique, and this is actually part of what differs between the Canadian circumstance and what is referred to as the Mother Parliament in the United Kingdom, is we have far more written and defined frameworks in terms of what our constitutional framework looks like in Canada than the United Kingdom does. They are largely based on the assumption of tradition that is long been litigated, and but to note, and again, for those who are watching, the Prime Minister is not mentioned once in our Constitution. The Prime Minister as an individual, and not just the current Prime Minister, but the title Prime Minister. That's tradition, and it speaks to. And the reason why I use that as an example is because we have this understanding that it's Parliament that creates acts. So it is by the power of Parliament that anything gets accomplished in terms of a governing perspective. And then it gets a little bit complicated when you add common law and civil law into the discussion. I know that, and the impacts that has on the Supreme Court, and just the history of the coming together of two very different systems and the creation of what is modern day Canada. And that's I'd let the lawyers in the room speak to more of the specifics of exactly of that. But what is interesting, the reason why it has such, that I explain that when it comes to the relevance related to Bill C-270, is that it is, Parliament is basically, it is applying itself to a criminal matter, saying this is our expectation. And then it does create some space for regulations to be made to ensure that it gets done. And everything that exists in terms of government in Canada, and this is something that often gets forgotten, actually. In fact, there was a little bit of controversy when it was, I believe it was around 2015, maybe just after the 2015 election. A reporter had said, "Oh, well, government stays, but parliaments come and go." And in a sense, that is practically true. But the only reason why government exists is because Parliament says that it does. So a department exists because Parliament says that a department exists, or not. So government is, in effect, a function of Parliament. And I'll say that again because it's a very important aspect to how our system works. Government in our Westminster system of governance is a function of Parliament. And it's a key part of how we ensure that things actually get accomplished, which is part of why the power that can be exercised through the process of a private member's bill and the reporting requirement to get back to the House so that we can do our best to get this passed without having a delay on something that whether it was 338, there may have been a few individuals that were paired or not there, but the fact that it received unanimous support is a big deal. So the fact that Parliament is able to project itself and say, this is our expectation, here will be the penalties, here is what our expectation, the line in the sand that says this is not a permitted activity in our nation is key. And then the Act very specifically empowers different government departments to be able to say, okay, here's how we're empowering you to make sure that this gets fulfilled. And that is a key element of how we ensure that that it actually solves the problems that it is set out to, in fact, solve. So that is, I would suggest, and I know there's a lot of talk about what's happened and from all, I'm sure, political sides and whatnot when it comes to what's been dominating the headlines to our friends south of the 49th parallel, although I think we are south of the 49th parallel here, but I come from the west where the 49th parallel is a big deal. But it's one of those key differences between the way that we govern ourselves north of the border and the way that the Americans govern themselves in the sense of it being a constitutional republic. And I wish, and this is part I lament that we don't have more constitutional history taught in our schools, because I think if we did, and I find it really interesting actually that and I won't get too much into this because I might not be able to stop talking, but the whole Americanization of Canadian discourse and how the Liberals they are famous for this. They often accuse their political opponents of it, but they are truly the ones that often and throughout Canadian history have to the point where, and I'll just share this very, very brief anecdote, but when John A. Macdonald won, I think it was his second majority government, the then Liberal Party wanted to build the Canadian Pacific Railway through the States because it would have been easier, which wow, that we might not have a country today if that was the case. Anyways, I digress on that front. Another quote from an organization that is, I think, very important to share into the context of the discussion to which we're having is from the Montreal Council of Women. And it says the following. On behalf of the membership of the Montreal Council of Women, I wish to confirm our deep concern for those whose lives have been upended by having their images involuntarily and or without consent shared on websites and other platforms, such as the Montreal-based Pornhub. The proposed Stopping Internet Sexual Exploitation Act bill calls for much-needed amendments to be made to the Criminal Code to protect children and those who have not given consent for their images or content or other content to be shared and commodified. I've talked a little bit about the idea of consent, about the corporate actors involved, and how the amendments to the criminal code and just a little bit of the history surrounding some of those things. But I would just note there's one word there that I think deserves being highlighted in addition to the entire quote and the endorsement of the SISE Act. And that is the idea of this content being commodified, and it's I think a key a word that deserves a little bit of exploration, because when it comes to you have in many cases, and I've shared some of where this explicit material might have been, how it might have been obtained, whether it was through consensual or not, whether it was known that it would be taking place or not. And those are all things that need to be addressed. This bill does a good job at helping get to the point where we can start to do exactly that. There is, though, the idea of the commodification of something like this. And certainly there's I think a larger philosophical and political argument that could be had about the commodification of intangible things. But I want to pare this down to the very basics of what this means for an individual that would have their picture or video, or it could be something else that is revealing. The fact that you have something that could be commodified for the monetary, and the whole idea of a commodity is that it by definition is something that then would be bought and sold. But here is again where we had that previous understanding of what a relationship between a thief and the clerk behind the counter being told to hand over the cash. You have something similar here. This is not a fair trading relationship in terms of what a commodity would be. You have, in many cases, corporate actors that are making decisions on how their platforms work that have devastating consequences. You have the individual who is the subject of this material that did not give consent, or the consent to which they did give was not voluntary, as we explored very briefly here just a few minutes ago. You have that idea that it's that commodity idea that there's a back and forth. This is not that. It is the fact that without the consent, without the ability for the individual to which is the subject of the content, they have been removed from this commodification type of exchange. And as a result, they, although are impacted the most, and we've talked a little bit about some of the devastating consequences, whether that be mental health, whether that be shame, leading to addiction, whatever the case is. But you have an example here where the subject has been removed from the exchange, and that is an absolutely devastating consequence of what and I would suggest further, and what makes it truly something that should be criminal, is that the impacts, they are the ones that face the most significant impacts of that. And I think it speaks to how important it is that the weight of the justice system can be involved in ensuring that does not have that you can stop that exchange, that commodification of something that should never have been commodified, because the subject of which the thing that has been commodified was not either a beneficiary and was not involved in the decision making of that process. And as we've discussed, the consequences can be absolutely horrific. another quote from an organization that has and have talked a little bit about the United Kingdom and in terms of its parliament, but it's.
I'm sorry. Yes. Can you your name, please? Can you tell me,
Hi, I'm Brandon.
Mr. MP Leslie?
Yes, I'm going to be here for a number of hours. I was trying to search online to get a better understanding, so I'm wondering if you might be able to provide for me a few other pieces of information. Have you, as chair, received a full list of witnesses yet? And who are those witnesses?
This is not a point of order at all, no.
You, Mr. Malone, I hear something on the right side. Yes, I'm sorry. Can you start again? What is your
Yeah,
point
I'm
of
gonna-
order
I
on your
understand I'm
on
going
your
to be
colleagues?
here in,
I've
sorry,
said
go
in the
ahead.
beginning when we started. I know you just walked in. Please wait till I recognize you, Mr. Leslie, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to be here for a number of hours, it looks like, so I'm just trying to get a better understanding of who the witnesses for this committee or for the study will be.
All right, appreciate that. That's not a point of order. I think right now we're debating whether to extend for 30 days in order to allow us to bring witnesses in and study the motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're very welcome. MP Couric, the floor is yours.
To study your colleagues' bill.
Thank you. Appreciate my colleague's intervention, and certainly the I think the key that we have before us. We have a ton of people who have supported. In fact, again, I'd emphasize, and I appreciate my new colleague from Portage, Lisgar, that great part of southern Manitoba, comes from a farming family, and we share some of those down to earth values and just the need for common sense in the discourse to which we have before us. So the fact that the amendment that we have here would extend the study of something that people support. I have read through a number of organizations that are great examples that have shared their unequivocal support for the work that is being done to ensure that Bill C-270 gets across the finish line. And I just referenced that there's a number of organizations that provide unique perspectives and expertise that have, and including ones that some are nonpartisan and some certainly I don't think would call themselves traditional conservative supporters. So it speaks to the nonpartisan nature to which we can approach this and actually get this back to the House of Commons, get those final hours of debate, get it voted on, and hopefully we can get it our friends in the other place, known as the Senate, although it seems often much further away than just down the street, but nonetheless, just down the street, hopefully they can likewise see that support that the House has thus far given Bill C-270. But CCUK, and they describe themselves in their quote, so I will just read the quote into the record, Madam Chair. It says, CCUK is a human rights charity working to end sexual exploitation by exposing and dismantling its cultural and commercial drivers. As a result, our sights are set on the pornography industry, which has evaded regulation and accountability for decades. We thoroughly welcome Bill C-270, which will prevent pornography sites from profiting from videos of non-consensual pornography and child abuse. Legislation that demands age and consent checks from anyone featured in pornographic content is necessary as a minimum standard for ensuring individual safety and well-being. And we urge the Canadian Parliament to support this bill. And I think that
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Brown.
I'm mindful of, excuse me, I'm mindful of the time. While members have the privilege of getting up and stretching their legs and using the facilities, I'm mindful of the fact, if you let me finish, Mr. Biddle, without interrupting, you'd understand why. The interpreters do not. I'm wondering if we could break for a health break.
Yes, I think that would be in order. If we could take a 5-minute
Thank you.
break to allow interpreters and others to stretch their legs. Just one moment, please, Monsieur Fortin, oui?
Bonjour, Madame la
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I also say hello. It's the first time I appear here today. I'd just like to know this. Do you have an idea of how long our Conservative colleagues will continue to have the floor on this bill? Do we have some sort of idea of how long this filibuster is going to last? Thank you, Mr. Fortin. Hey, that's a very good question indeed, but unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you. In the 5 minutes or so that we will take our health break, you might be able to speak directly with your Conservative colleagues because, we'd like to finish as quickly as possible after the.
Have an extension and be able to talk about this very, very important PMB as MP Kirk has been eloquently speaking. There's a lot of good in that PMB that I think we really need to study it because, quite frankly, it's important to many people. And me as a woman, I find it very also important to many people. And I think we all agree around the table. Alors, j'aimerais très bien.
So, yeah, I would certainly, if it is at all possible, like to have us work together a little bit so that we can act quickly to pass this motion as quickly as possible so that we can come back to it after the break and resume the study. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to hear you say that. I think my colleague from the NDP as well would echo my sentiments, would like to see this move forward. But I just have a question of intent here. Do the rules provide for a maximum time of debate, a duration of debate? Because the committee is supposed to end at 1 o'clock. It's now 1:08. Are we going to continue until 7 o'clock tonight, until midnight tonight? What are the rules with respect to debate on this? If you could give me some specific detail, I would be very happy. Yes, of course, but from what I understand, the rule is this. We can continue if the committee wants to continue until there is a vote. So we can continue until there is a bell for votes. But it is if the committee chooses to do so. But I want to continue if we work on the bill. But are we going to adjourn, Clark, for a question period? No, it's not necessary. Only if there are votes. That's when we would have to rise. So I would think that we could continue until 7 o'clock tonight, or not necessarily. We can go to midnight if there are resources for it. Oh, okay. And during that time, I just wanted to get some sort of idea of how long our Conservative colleagues would be speaking. Thank you. So we'll take our 5-minute health break.
are returning. I believe everybody is in the room in one location or another, but, so, Mr. Couric, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I hope everyone was able to take care of the call of nature, and we look forward to being able to get back to this very important important discussion. And I would just note, Madam Chair, I've been very intentional in my remarks with precision, talking about organizations and endorsements to this bill, talking about the need to get it across the proverbial finish line. And as a result, and I would just share that when originally planning to join in this conversation, I had hoped that there would be the opportunity for us to ask questions of some of the important witnesses that were submitted. I believe our side had submitted them close to a week ago. But we are here today discussing the bill, and I know the amendment to extend it, which puts at risk the ability for this very important piece of legislation. So as we're getting back to the discussion here today, just to highlight how important it is that we actually get this across the finish line, and that a 30-day delay is quite possibly the equivalent to what I had discussed so quite briefly before about seeing it die at committee. So it is so important that we get this sorted, get this across the finish line, and I will, if I could, Madam Chair, continue to share some of the organizations that have done such good work across across the country and in other parts of the world as well, because I know that, especially with the internet, and this, if I could just pause it, and I'll get back to the to the endorsement that this bill has from so many organizations. And again, it was supported by every member of Parliament. It's been endorsed by a whole host of organizations. But one of the things that I think it is understated. It used to be that when we had issues that would come forward, in particular of a criminal matter, prior to the internet, it was pretty easy to delineate what happened where and how. You were in a jurisdiction, a crime was committed in said jurisdiction, and then prosecution could take place, etc. With the advent of the internet, and this and cyberspace more generally, but the virtual nature of it, it really changes the understanding of borders in terms of its impact here. So the key is, with 270, making sure that we're drawing that line that is so important to be drawn, to say Canada is not the place for this. But it also is very important in the context of Canada cannot be a place where this is allowed to happen for that very well could, and I would suggest will, if we can get this bill across the finish line, will have a global impact. And we often hear, and while I could speak, and I won't get into that here, I could speak at length about the frustrations I have with the Trudeau government's foreign policy and some of just the deterioration of Canada's how we are viewed abroad, and just a whole host of things around that. I don't want to get into that, because I want to stay very focused on Bill C-270 here. But one of the things that I think the world needs to know is that Canada is willing to take a strong stand, to say this is what is, there are things that are not acceptable, and in Canada we draw the line. And we have the opportunity to ensure that when it comes to sexual exploitation and the materials associated with that, and the wide impact that has, this bill will be that signal to the world that says Canada is not a haven for these sorts of corporate bad actors, that individuals, that it is not allowed. There are consequences to that, that we can stand in terms of our global partners, whether that be through various law enforcement agencies, intelligence, et cetera, to be able to say, no, look, Canada is a place where justice and the rule of law is strong, and that there are consequences to exploiting those who are most vulnerable within our society. And I think that signal would be not only important in the context of where we are as a in this issue, but also there's a host of periphery issues around law and order, and I know I want to stay focused on C-270, but it has those the issues surrounding internet sexual exploitation and some of the crime and the nature of how that happens in different parts of and the different parts of the underground economy, for example. You have seen a massive growth in some of these things over the last number of years. And as a result, there are many that are questioning the ability for Canada to be able to stand up for the rule of law. And whenever we talk about these things, we have to keep at the forefront of our minds the victims of in this case, it's those who are the subject of this exploited material. That's pretty straightforward. But when it comes to criminal justice matters across the board, there is a very, I would suggest, clear, a very clear need to be able to say, look, Canada is not a place where crime can flourish. We are a country that expects that the rule of law is upheld. And as a result, with the rule of law being upheld, we can ensure that the victims of crimes are in fact protected, because the best way to ensure that victims are protected is to ensure that there are fewer victims. And that's one of my biggest frustrations about many of the discussions around criminal justice and some of the reforms that have been brought about, especially over the last 9 or so years. We have seen a deterioration of the things that have traditionally been you used to be able to just take for granted that somebody who would be convicted of a crime would stay in prison, that there would be justice for individuals who faced who perpetrated an injustice. And I think that the deterioration of that trust is something that there are tangible aspects to it. And anybody who's been the victim of a crime, it's a very you hear from them. You can hear it in their voice. There's a very clear understanding of that. But the fact that we can, and I would suggest need to, and we have before us an example of how we were able to take steps in the right direction to ensure that we protect Canadians and to send that signal globally to the world that Canada is not a safe haven for lawlessness, that we're not a safe haven for bad corporate actors when it comes to things like explicit material that has been obtained through non-consensual means, that there's a clear mechanism that exists in terms of being able to ensure that we get action for to protect some of the most vulnerable that exist, and the best, especially when it comes to law and order reforms, these justice reforms that are so important, is the best solution is that when you reduce the number of victims. And it's a somewhat intangible thing, because you're speaking in a way that means there will be fewer people affected. But that's the point, because when there are fewer victims, it demonstrates that you are actually able to address some of these challenges. So there is the responsibility for all of us around this table and every MP supporting this bill getting to this stage. And I would hope that the ability, while I wish we would have been able to question witnesses today, but instead we're debating an extension that could regrettably kill this bill if it was to pass. All of these things surrounding this, but at the very root of all of this, it has to be we can stand up for the victims who have been and help reduce the number of victims that there will be going forward. And as a result, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that that does in fact happen, and certainly myself and I know my colleagues, and including the sponsor of this bill, who's done a ton of work to help make that in fact happen. So we have this responsibility. And my hope is that the members of the government that are trying to delay the passing of this bill, that it is that instead of putting
One moment, Mr. Yes, MP Biddle, please.
On an issue of relevancy, Madam Speaker, Mr. Carrick's been very good in the last hour and a half, but accusing us of delaying it where he's been talking for an hour and a half, where the only point of contention is the sponsor of the bill refusing to appear. If he comes to appear, I'm happy to discuss it and get it through as quickly as possible, but it's rather cowardly that he refuses to attend, and the Conservatives are covering up him not attending. So I was wondering if Mr. Carrick could use his next hour and a half to explain why Mr. Viersen, who is passionate about this issue, refuses to appear, and why the cowardly act.
Thank you, Mr. Biddle. And MP Carrick, I'm going to let you continue. I think you were speaking on the motion before us.
Thank you, and I do appreciate it, and I think it touches to something that is incredibly relevant, is because we could have before us witnesses that could be talking about how important this bill is. Yet here we have instead a proposal by the Liberals to delay and quite possibly kill this important bill that would help set a standard in this country to say it is not okay to exploit those who are most vulnerable. So I would suggest that I will continue to share some organizations. Thank you, that have made a very, very clear statement, sharing how important it is that we pass this bill, that we pass it quickly, and when it comes to the members of the governing party, I would hope that, like they supported this bill in its at second reading, I would sure hope that there's not some nefarious motive that would suggest that they would stand up for some of the most egregious actors, both in terms of individuals or corporate actors in our society. Because certainly when it comes to the history, and I referenced before the close connection that this bill has with Bill S-210, it was quite frankly astounding that you would have the government, and in particular the cabinet, of the Liberals that would bow down to the lobbyists of some of the most egregious corporate actors on the planet, instead of standing up for, in the case of Bill C-210, minors, and ensuring that they are protected in our society. So I would suggest that in the lack of there being witnesses before us, and I would note that we could have been there today, but we're not, and I will read a quote from Parents Aware. And they likewise describe their organization a little bit in the quote, so I will share this quote with the committee and their endorsement of Bill C-270. Parents Aware offers our full support on the Criminal Code amendments that are proposed in the Stopping Internet Sexual Exploitation Act. We feel that the addition of these offenses with penalties is an effective way to hold companies and individuals criminally responsible when creating and distributing pornographic content depicting underage participants. So here you have, Madam Chair, another organization that does good work in helping bring awareness to some of the risks that exist in terms of the online world, and in particular the impact that can have on minors. And I would just note I found it interesting. We did a TikTok study during my time on the ethics committee, and it was very enlightening. And it connects to this because it speaks to how the speed to which technology is evolving. And in particular, there are studies that suggest that the use of TikTok has similar endorphin type responses in the brain to that which is pulling a slot machine. And it's that sort of thing that, and the algorithms and the content that exist, and I know there was a big, and I won't get into the specifics of that because that would be off topic, and I wouldn't want to get off topic here. But there was a big announcement yesterday related to TikTok from the government, which I have no doubt will be studied at probably the ethics committee, but we have this responsibility to ensure that there is that the justice system is responsive to the bad actors that are preying on some of the advances that have taken place and the access. And I think that it's access. We are in the internet age, and in fact, you have and I've talked quite a bit about at different points in time. You have kind of the first version of the internet. Well, it was that idea that the world could be connected, that there was access, that one computer could connect to another computer. That was a revolutionary concept that obviously expanded significantly, and it came with the idea that there was information associated with that. And then you kind of move into this Web 2 type scenario. So you had kind of Web 1, which was the access part. So you had, that's a news website would be a good example of that, right? You have now access to content, an encyclopedia, so to speak, at your fingertips that you might not have had prior to that point. And then Web 2 comes along. And that's very much the idea of social media. Right, it's this interactive type. So my social media will look different than my colleagues' social media, than the folks that are watching their social media, Madam Chair, than your social media. It all looks different, and it's the same thing in terms of every aspect of that. You have algorithms. That idea of Web 2. It is no longer just a brochure or a library online. It's something that is actually responsive. It's a kitchen table that is truly the entire world all at once, all speaking at the same time. But we are moving from that to what is often referred to as Web 3. And that is the world in which it's certainly less tangible in the sense that you have you're involving artificial intelligence. And AI, I think it gets there's certain expectations. You look to sci-fi dystopian type future movies where robots take over the world, and that's not what I think what the point is, but rather the point is that you have now the ability for the internet to start to do some of the content curation on its own. So it's not simply responding to you, but it's interpreting how you would want to respond to something. And the key here in terms of that can have an impact in terms of the ability for content to be created. So it is, and that's where I referenced before the work that's been done by one of my colleagues in terms of deep fakes. That's one small part of that. That's the creation of content. But it can also be the scraping of content. And what happens with, and we see this in terms of copyright for music. You can ask ChatGPT today or any AI chat generator to write you a song. And it's quite something. And I'd encourage those who maybe haven't had the chance to do so, go play around with that, because it gives you some insight into the level of interaction that the Web 3 world will have. And you see it in the context of a chat generator. But the reason why it connects so closely with C270 is that in the absence of there being a clear framework for accountability, it does not limit what is the leaps and bounds advancement in terms of how that will impact people, including including victims of exploitation in the future. So we have a circumstance where it started off, and it was pretty easy with Web number one, because it was it was just basically the world going online and being connected. So access was a big part of it. Web 2 algorithms have and still are a big part of what this future is. But Web 3 is now, it's taking it to the next step. So we have to make sure that, in particular, when it comes to the content to which there may not be consent, that we develop the legal and a framework to ensure that bad actors, that there are consequences for their actions, both corporate and individual. And when it comes to the role that, as parents aware, as an organization, and I know there's a whole host of other groups that are doing good work in terms of talking about how to keep kids safe online, and it's of course the boogeyman type scenario where there is a bad actor on the other end that would try and do terrible things, but it's becoming more than just that. It is opening up a world of danger online that we all carry with us and have access to in terms of the devices to which we all keep in our pockets and we vote on, etc. But we have to ensure that there is that still the actors that would perpetrate the crimes, that they can be held responsible. That's where it really comes down to. And like the organization that I just referenced, you have a clear example where there is the ability for there to be consequences for those actions. Now, Madam Chair, I had spoken a little bit about the story of Joy Smith, and my wife Danielle had the opportunity to volunteer in her office back in 2015, and just the incredible legacy and the work that's been done. And I know my colleague across the way has done a tremendous amount of work when it comes to helping combat human trafficking, and I believe his bill, did it receive royal assent? There's a host of work that's been done by members from all political parties to help get to take action on these very, very important issues. And Mrs. Joy Smith was one of those individuals in Parliament, and her and the foundation that stands in her name is still doing some of that work. And the quote from the Joy Smith Foundation is as follows: "Canadians must take a stand and insist that our country not be a safe haven for people to financially benefit from the recorded sexual victimization of anyone, especially youth. The SISE Act is a necessary step in ensuring that those who capitalize on filmed sex crimes are held accountable for the immense harms their actions cause." Now, in true to fashion, Mrs. Smith, her quote, like her time in Parliament, she doesn't. She's not afraid of throwing the punches, and exactly as she outlines, we have an opportunity to draw a line to say, look, this is not acceptable action in our country. And I hope that we can not only not see this bill die at committee because of a delay, but rather we can see with as I've been endeavoring to do, to highlight some of the important organizations that have a show of expertise, and when they're endorsing, it's a pretty good indication of the value that this bill has for combating this egregious activity that has unfortunately that has and is happening in our country, and let's make sure that it certainly is able to be stopped going forward. Now, I would also share a quote from the Hope Resource Center. This association does a tremendous amount of good work in providing hope to those who are facing significant challenges. And I would read their quote that says this: "Hope Resource Center is confident the SISE Act will provide necessary systemic protective changes as we lead by example to encourage global collaboration through increased awareness and prevention action within Canada to this insidious form of abuse, internet sexual exploitation. And again, we have another example here where there is an acknowledgement that that by leadership here in Canada, we can take a strong stand that says enough is enough and can demonstrate a level of leadership in the world. And as we, I think, have the opportunity to demonstrate that, it will send a signal that says that enough is enough. We are going to stop it, and enough is enough. And and now, if only we could ensure that this bill gets back to the House, we can ensure that that does in fact happen. But my encouragement is that by ensuring that this gets accomplished as soon as is possible, the ability for us to demonstrate to the world that our justice system is able to be responsive. Now, I have a further quote from the EFC, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, that says the following: by requiring that the age of consent of every person depicted in sexually explicit material be verified before it is posted online, the Stopping Internet Sexual Exploitation Act puts the responsibility where it belongs. We support this bill's measures to ensure illegal content is not uploaded in the first place. And I would just highlight that that's key, because we have a, if you can stop this process as early in and send that chill through the actors that might be that are perpetrating these crimes to begin with, you can effectively ensure that you stop the victimization from the earliest opportunity. And the ability to do just that, I would suggest, is a key part of why this needs to get accomplished, and accomplished within the timeline to ensure the greatest chance possible. And I had the opportunity to very briefly discuss why the timeline for that is so important. I would, however, the idea of ensuring that there is that consent is key, because it places the responsibility of where with those who have the best opportunity to ensure that it is effectively managed. You have the individuals who are creating the content. Obviously, that's a big part of it. The non-consensual side is another element to this. But to ensure that those who are creating the content and those who are distributing the content, those two key actors here, and I can't emphasize enough, because that is where the responsibility can, and I would suggest should be. Because as it's outlined in this bill, you have those are the individuals that are not just creating, that are victimizing in the first circumstance, but then by their actions are creating that cycle of victimization that can have such devastating consequences in individuals' lives who are affected. And in particular, we of course have the impact that has on minors. But also we do have the impact that has disproportionately on women, but also on all those who are affected, and the many that, as we referenced earlier, do suffer in silence. I would like to further read a quote from the Justice Defense Fund. There is, and they say this: there is not a more important piece of legislation to protect victims from criminal sexual exploitation online than mandatory age and consent verification for pornography production and distribution online. This is a long overdue, common sense, and urgently needed regulation that has the potential to protect thousands, if not millions, of individuals, including children, from facing life-altering, traumatic sexual abuse. Now, what's interesting is, in particular, these folks, they highlight something that I would suggest is worth noting, and I'll spend just a very brief moment talking about this. And that is the idea of sexual abuse in terms of the subject matter. That there is both of course the abuse in terms of the instance, and the horrific nature of that and the impact that can have. But whenever you add the content side of that, somebody being the subject of exploitation, and the fact that is recorded, whatever the case is, and that creates a re-victimization every time. That is not just viewed by that individual and the trauma associated with that, and that individual who is the victim, but the fact that there is a weight and a heaviness associated with that person then has to live with for the rest of their life. And I shared a couple of examples and stories of where there's been such a...
Excuse me, yes, point of order from MP Biddle.
That's a very important point that Mr. Curick's bringing up, but again, it's a relevancy issue because what he's talking about is in the Online Harms Act, which I would love for us to get to. It isn't in this legislation, so I was hoping he could focus his remarks on why Mr. Viersen refuses to come and appear on his own legislation.
Thank you, Mr.
Great question, though.
That's a question. Thank you, Mr. Biddle.
I'm curious.
MP Curick.
Well, it is, I would suggest, Madam Chair, that it is incredibly relevant to the conversation to which we have, because if Mr. Biddle would have read Bill C-270, he would note the close parallel to what I am discussing and exactly what we are talking about here today, and the fact that Bill C-270 very specifically articulates the need for consequences for egregious actions that have taken place. But the good news is that, as I had described very briefly earlier, as autonomous members of Parliament, or the autonomy that we are granted as members of Parliament, we are given, and in the guidelines of being able to stay relevant on the subject at hand, the Justice Defence Fund, I would suggest, has a particular expertise, and that expertise being lended to this committee in the purpose of saying, let's get this done so that we can, and I'll just, for the benefit of Mr. Biddle, emphasize one part of their endorsement of this bill. This is urgently needed and has the potential to protect thousands, if not millions, of individuals, including children, from facing life-altering, traumatic, and sexual abuse. So I would hope that Mr. Biddle takes that very, very seriously. And I would suggest further, Madam Chair, that as I think I've outlined quite fairly, and have endeavored to not get super political here. Now, that will be something that I know some of my colleagues from the other side might have trouble believing. But when we have a bill that was was supported by all members, has such widespread support, and I would suggest there's a lot more areas where I could have gotten political, even in my what has been, I think, could have been a significantly longer intervention thus far. I've endeavored to keep it as brief as I can. But to ensure that we have this very direct understanding of what we are trying to accomplish here, and I would suggest that it is key for ensuring that we can actually get it done. And I would just note, I think that one of the aspects of Parliament that we sometimes gets a bad rap for not getting any stuff done. And if you look at how the Liberals have paralyzed the House of Commons over the last number of months, it's certainly an evidence of that. But I want to stick to C-270 here. But this is a chance where we can truly get something accomplished, and then get to work at ensuring that it can pass in the other place as well, or what we refer to as the other place, but that being the upper chamber of Canada's Parliament, the Senate of Canada, where I would hope and certainly have the expectation, because I know that they've addressed a number of bills similar to this in the past and have been able to endorse them, and I think that certainly gives me some hope that we could get this sorted. Because when it comes to actually getting this done, if this is delayed by 30 days, like the motion that we are discussing here today, all of the things that I've endeavored to articulate as succinctly as possible, all of that gets lost, and we have to restart this process. And we don't want to do that. We want to actually get stuff done, and I think for Canadians, they want to see that this action is in fact taken. I'd like to share a quote, if I could, Madam Chair, from Andrea Hines, and she has this to say: "An integral part of this valuable bill is to focus on our youth and ensure each person whose image is depicted in the material is a consenting 18 years or older. Having worked over 7,000 cases of survivors of human trafficking and their families, it is critical the criminal code be amended to ensure the safety of these underaged individuals." Now, I'm very glad that Mr. Biddle had brought up something that has such close relevance to this bill, and I would suggest that one of the things that we've heard, and I've certainly heard from constituents in relation to the concerns around their bill C-63, is that it's off the point in terms of actually the accomplishing of the set objective. I don't think anybody is opposed to what they would suggest the bill accomplishes, but it's the, as they say, the proof is in the pudding. And here we have an example of where that bill falls, I would suggest, short, and there's a whole host of issues that I don't want to get into here, because we're sticking to the very relevant subject matter at hand, although we could probably talk at length about Bill C-63 and some of the issues related to that. But where Bill C-270 really gets the mark is that it puts very, very clear parameters into ensuring that there are consequences for bad actors. And I would suggest that it is that clarity and the as I outlined before when I went through the bill, that ensuring that there is this needed certainty so that Canada marks that line, as I've talked about, that we have this, that we signal to those actors, that we signal to the world to say Canada is not a haven for these bad actors. And I would just note that in this quote, this individual, having worked with 7,000 cases of survivors related to human trafficking. So that's 7,000 is a big number. That is a lot of individuals who have faced just the incredible impact that crime has on victims and those survivors. And I would suggest, Madam Chair, that we look at that number and don't just gloss over it, because 7,000 is you're talking about, that's 7,000 individuals that have parents, that have a mom and a dad, that have siblings, that have in some cases probably have kids, that have grandparents, that are certainly the number of people impacted by just this individual's work speaks to how important of an issue this is to ensure that we're actually addressing the issues that Canadians expect us to be able to address. So I would, Madam Chair, further like to share a quote from the Ottawa Coalition to End Human Trafficking. And it says the following, and I quote: "This issue requires priority, attention, and dedication on all fronts, and thus far has not been treated in this manner by Parliament. A legislative gap that Bill C-270 will fill in our criminal justice system. The victims involved in this investigation and the thousands of other victims out there deserve our greatest efforts and support. And Bill C-270 will provide the support in more ways than one." Sometimes you just can't time things better than this, but certainly when it comes to the issue at hand, we're debating an extension. and the Ottawa Coalition to End Human Trafficking talks about how Bill C-270 fills the gaps needed. So I would suggest that the simple and straightforward and common sense solution is, while we should have been addressing the issue with witnesses here today, we do not want to see this unnecessarily delayed, and it's to ensure that there is organizations like this that are highlighting some of the concerns that we take with the diligence and the need to get this stuff sorted out. And in this case, let's get Bill C-270 back to Parliament. We don't need to extend it by 30 days. We need to get it back to Parliament, so hopefully it can get passed, or at least has the very best chance of passing before this Parliament comes to an end. And although certainly if the Liberals just handed over the documents in SDTC, we'd be back to private members' business, but I digress on that front. Further to that, I would suggest that there is a...
Thank you so much. That actually wasn't relevant if Mr. Keurig could get back to the topic at question,
Yes.
which is the
Yes.
Arnold Pearson unwilling and too cowardly to come and testify.
On that same point, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Biddle. Mr. Chambers?
Thank you very much. It's my first time at this committee. It's wonderful. I believe Mr. Keurig
welcome.
has demonstrated an ability to bring it home and to bring it back to the subject
Yeah.
at hand.
So thank you, Mr. Chambers. Mr. Currick?
Thank you very much. And the good news is, for Mr. Biddle's sake, that I am keeping it absolutely on topic. That while I am tempted to diverge from the subject at hand, I'm wanting to keep this as much politics out of this as is possible. For his benefit, and we'll see. I might have an opportunity to have a dialogue with him later in the House of Commons related to the SDTC issue. So I would suggest, Madam Chair, you know, I've read, and I have a few more that I will get to, because there are just it is almost overwhelming, the amount of support that we have before us for the passing of Bill C-270, and I would suggest that there is this clear opportunity that Parliament has to be able to say, okay, let's simply get the job done. And what's interesting is that when you have some issues before us, there's, you know, the political sides, and that's fair. That's a very common thing. That's the nature of discourse. There's two sides to each debate, and what is interesting when it comes to the subject that we have at hand, we have I would hope a desire to see the right thing accomplished. And when it comes down to it, it is not just talking about a bill as it stood after a second reading vote, where it received that unanimous endorsement, but it's actually seeing it get implemented in a way that solves that works towards solving some of the significant challenges that we face. And in this particular case, those who have been victims of this egregious exploitation, that we throw the book at those who deserve the book being thrown at, put them away there where they belong for a very, very long time, and ensure that victims are given the support and the peace in knowing that we've taken every action possible to ensure that what happened to them, there is the least likelihood possible that will happen to anyone else. So, Madam Chair, I would further like to highlight a quote from the Soar Optimus International Western Canada region. They say the following: "To be protected when vulnerable is a human right, as outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Soro Optimist International recognizes that for the pornography industry, women and girls have greater vulnerabilities that include young age, financial insecurity, and exposure to sexualized violence. Social protections for youth must include protection from participation in pornographic materials and sexualized images being shared online. That is why SIWCR supports Bill C-270 and will continue to educate women and girls about their rights. And I think that, Madam Chair, we have before us, as was highlighted, those who are disproportionately at risk of becoming victims, to be able to send the signal very clearly that there is that Parliament, the supreme lawmaking authority of the land, and the signal that sends to those actors in our country, but also to the world, that we're willing to take this issue seriously and do something about it is absolutely key. So to highlight, the Stopping Internet Sexual Exploitation Act, it will prohibit making or distributing pornographic material for a commercial purpose without verifying the age and express voluntary consent of the people depicted. And it allows surety around that idea of consent, the ability to revoke consent, express consent, and it being done in a voluntary manner. And the number of endorsements that this bill has is absolutely astounding. I've read through some of the quotes, but we have before us the Montreal Council of Women, the Colchester Sexual Assault Centre, the DD working to end sexual exploitation, VK Savas of the Sexual Assault and Violence Intervention Services of Halton, Salvation Army, the Ottawa Coalition to End Human Trafficking, CCUK, Parents Aware, London Abused Women's Centre, the Foundation RA, the Ally Global Foundation, the National Centre on Sexual Exploitation, the National Council of Women of Canada, the Hope Resource Centre Association, the Joy Smith Foundation, and I know that there is so many others. Now, I would, and I'm not sure if it'll be close to the conclusion of my remarks, but we'll have to see about that. But I think that this is certainly something that is of the utmost importance in the subject matter before us. And I am going to share some survivor testimonies, because I think that one of the to ensure that we protect victims, we need to highlight the devastating impacts of what happens when they are not protected. So I'm going to share a few of these things and let not just the words of a politician from rural Alberta speak, but rather the words from individuals who have faced the devastating consequences of the gaps that exist in the legal, criminal, and legislative and regulatory frameworks in our country, and why, again, I highlight the need to not delay this by 30 days, but to get this bill passed. There's an individual, goes by the name Rachel, from Canada, that says this: "It's devastating. I mean, this is something that is going to haunt me for the rest of my life. I will always be someone's porn. I did not consent to this video being made, nor to it being uploaded to Pornhub." I don't think, Madam Chair, that any commentary is needed on that, but rather than for Rachel in her comments to speak to why we need to get the job done. I would share, again, another testimony from the Standing Committee on ethics, on its study on Pornhub in 2021. Serena says, I quote, "I stopped going to school. I got really depressed. I thought that once I stopped being in public so much, once I stopped going to school, people would stop re-uploading it. But that didn't happen because it had already been basically downloaded by people all across the world. It would always be uploaded over and over and over again. No matter how many times I got it taken down, it would be right back up again. Again, that was testimony to the Standing Committee on Ethics on the Pornhub study. And I would note, because I think this bears emphasizing when it comes to the first quote that I had shared from Rachel, the company, when trying to get her, the video of which she was the subject removed, the company told her that removing the content was her responsibility. How absolutely and utterly disgusting is it that you have a bad corporate actor, because of a gap that exists in criminal law, being able to suggest that somehow the victim is responsible for dealing with the problem. Victoria Gailey said in testimony again to the previous ethics study on this issue. It says, and I quote, "There were over 8 million views just on Pornhub alone. To think of the amount of money that they made off my trauma, date rape, and sexual exploitation makes me sick to my stomach. I too feel like Pornhub has become my human trafficker, and they have been relentless in doing so." Wow is right. That was Victoria. Again, testimony that was heard. Rose Kalimba said the following, and I quote, "6 videos of my rape at age 14, uploaded by one of my attackers, stayed on Pornhub while they refused to remove them for over half a year. My cries to them were I begged them to take them down, stating that I was a minor and that it was not consensual, both of which were glaringly obvious, went unheard. Every single day I had to watch the view counts continue to rise, while ads appeared along with the rape video. The number of views eventually exceeded 2 million. A gap that exists that needs to be filled." That was Rose. Another witness had this to say, and I would highlight, Madam Chair, because of the sensitive content, there's a lot of people that don't want their names shared, and I understand that, because this is a process of re-traumatizing. This witness said this again at that study. "It wasn't until August of 2020 that I discovered those private videos had been uploaded to porn sites. Finding the photos led me to a video that I did not know existed. I found out by watching it on Pornhub. Whether I was asleep or drugged is impossible to know after the fact. But what is clear is in the video is that I am not conscious, and there is nothing to suggest consent." I spoke earlier about how the victimization doesn't end when at the conclusion of what would be a horrific and life-changing moment. It continues and continues. And to close the gaps that exist in regulation, Madam Chair, I think is incumbent upon all of us as members to, again, get the job done, not delay it by 30 days, get the job done. And the fact that this is a well-studied subject, I'm glad that there's opportunity and testimony that exists and on the stark reality of what happens when criminal law doesn't put those behind bars who need to be behind bars. Further, there is another testimony that says this, and I quote, "I was 17 when videos of me came to my knowledge. I was only 15 in the videos when they've been they've been profiting from. Every time they took it down, they also allowed more and more videos of me to be re-uploaded. I don't leave my house anymore. I stopped being able to work." And I would highlight the committee study that took place at Ethics was very specific to MindGeek, the company that owns Pornhub, and this is pretty specific to that. But I would, Madam Chair, emphasize that this is one example of where there are many bad actors, and in an industry that is built on exploitation. There was a submission to, again, the Ethics Committee study on this, where David, and I'd mentioned before that disproportionately the victims of this are women, but it is not, it's certainly not limited to women. David, and I quote from one of the submissions to that committee study. David, at 15 years old, was given Rofinol, known as, quote, having been roofied or a date rape drug, unquote, one evening after having snuck into a club. After searching several gay porn sites, he found himself in several videos. David found it impossible to have his videos removed, and he was a non-consenting minor. And then it goes on to talk about how that led to a cycle of addiction, including alcohol, cocaine, and eventually methamphetamine to try and erase the memories of the abuse to which he faced. So, Madam Chair, I would suggest, and it's hard. Those are the sort of testimony that is. It feels like a gut punch, and why I would suggest that when it comes to the issue of the amendment, or the motion rather, to see this extended, I'd highlighted some of the procedural stuff that exists for a reason, and the need to get this bill studied and reported back to the House so that we can have the best chance possible of it getting sorted. I would hope that some of the both testimony that I've shared, as well as the organizations that have endorsed Bill C-270. I've highlighted some of the specifics around why it matters. But then specifically, I would simply conclude by saying this. There is a chance that MPs have to help get this bill across the finish line. And I've shared both quotes from organizations that are involved with victims, and then what is, I would suggest, some of the toughest stuff that I've read into the record in Parliament in terms of words from victims themselves. So as I wrap up my remarks here, I would simply suggest that this doesn't need to be extended. This needs to be passed and reported back to Parliament. And I would therefore ask, and I believe I'm on the right procedural ground, I can ask for UC, but we'll still have the floor after. I would ask for unanimous consent that the committee do pass this bill and report it back to the House at the earliest opportunity.
I hear several no's. Thank you.
Okay. Then with that, Madam Chair, I find it unfortunate that there would be that unwillingness to do so. However, the next best way to get that accomplished is to allow it to be automatically reported back within the time frame that was originally discussed. So therefore, I do move to adjourn.
Okay, we have a motion to adjourn. Can we please ask for a vote on that, Mr. Clerk? Do you want a recorded vote? Because it could be
Madame
by
la
a show of
Présidente.
hands. Oui, Monsieur Fortin.
Yeah, just a question. I'd like a precision. What we're asking to adjourn is the debate on the motion, or is it the meeting? That's a good question. I think that we're asking to adjourn the meeting, today's meeting. So if I understand well, it would not adjourn debate on the motion. Is that correct? The adjournment is for the meeting, but it's also for debate. But when we'll be back, we can do it one more time. Is that clear? So debate can start again at the next meeting. Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, it's just an adjournment, not a conclusion.
C'est pas la conclusion.
It's not the conclusion of the debate. So I am asking, do you want?
Would you like a show of recorded vote? Okay, Mr. Clerk, please.
On the motion to adjourn the meeting, Mr. Maloney,
No.
Mr. Biddle,
No.
Mr. Mendicino,
No.
Madame Dillon,
No.
Mr. Maloney,
Mr.
Mr. Mickey, sorry, I'm sorry.
No.
Okay. Mr. Brock,
Yes.
Mr. Couric,
Yes.
Mr. Van Popta,
Yes.
Mr. Chambers? Oui. Mr. Fortin?
Oui.
Mr. McGregor?
No.
Nay, 6, nay, 9, nay, 5, sorry.
Okay, merci beaucoup. Alors,
Thank you so much. We will keep going with the motion.
okay, est-ce qu'on... Person on the list now? Mr. Maloney, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be much more brief than Mr. Couric was. You know, a couple of things he said stood out for me. One of them was that this piece of legislation could be a shining light to the rest of the world, and yet here we are, he and his colleagues, preventing his colleague who brought this bill to the House being denied the opportunity to come here and have the light shine on him and celebrate what Mr. Couric describes as this great achievement. It's absolutely shameful. I have never seen this in my 9 years as an MP, where members of your own party have gone to such great lengths to prevent you from appearing to defend your own position. It's astonishing. You know, another thing he said that stood out, he was listing the people, categories of people who are now allowed to bring forward private members' bills as cabinet members, parliamentary secretaries. He can now add Arnold Viersen to that list and take credit for him himself. I just hope, and he used the phrase a number of times, delaying sending this bill back to the House. It's quite the opposite. We're extending the time so Mr. Viersen and his colleagues, my parliamentary colleagues across the way, have an opportunity to stand here and share in that pride with Mr. Viersen to celebrate this bill. But they are denying it for reasons that they won't put on the record. So I'm going to ask the rest of you, as you're speaking today, keep that in mind. Be fair to your own colleague. Give Mr. Viersen his day, his moment to come here and give evidence on his bill so we can celebrate things that Mr. Couric outlined earlier today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maloney, for your brevity. I will... No, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm now going to go to MP Biddle, please.
So much, Madam Chair. I'll try to match Mr. Maloney's brevity. This is genuinely surprising because Mr. Viersen, I believe, was elected with the same time as me in 2015, and throughout his whole career has been a passionate advocate for protecting vulnerable people. And I commend him for that. But when the rubber meets the road in terms of legislation, he is nowhere to be found. And his members of his party are covering up for him. It started with Bill S-210, which was a bill the Conservatives were in favor of. It was a digital ID bill that I didn't agree with, but admired the intent to protect vulnerable people. Mr. Viersen, even though it was a Conservative bill, came to the committee I was on and filibustered it. Despite 9 years of saying he wanted to stand up, he wouldn't let that bill be studied. Wouldn't let it have its day. So unlike Mr. Maloney, I have seen this before. Conservatives pretending to care about vulnerable people. And I think most of them do. I imagine this is something from the leader's office that they say, please, dear God, don't let Arnold come and testify to this bill. What are they afraid of? Mr. Couric spoke for almost 2.5 hours and didn't mention Mr. Viersen once, did not mention his trust in his colleague. If they don't have trust in him, if they don't believe him, if they don't think he supports this legislation, maybe he should pass it on to someone else in the caucus. Or, alternatively, let's get this studied. Why don't bring him here this afternoon? Bring him here this afternoon. Let's have a study. Let's discuss it with him and do this important study. The other surprising thing, Mr. Couric spent a great deal of his time talking about things that aren't even in this bill. It's amazing. It's not a long bill. But Mr. Couric maybe reading things that don't exist, or maybe he read the online harms bill, because a lot of the victim impact statements that he talked about, which are compelling and important, and we need to discuss these things, are about taking it down off the internet. This bill does not accomplish that. So my hope is that it's not an issue of cowardice. I don't think that's Mr. Viersen's style. I think it's an issue of his colleagues not trusting him, not allowing him to speak, silencing. It's funny, in question period, they always accuse the Prime Minister of silencing his MPs and his cabinet ministers. Why aren't any of the members here standing up for Arnold? Mr. Brock's one of those ones that gets up and says, why is the Prime Minister silencing members of the Liberal caucus? And hypocritically, he sits here and just looks blankly as, well, don't let Arnold come and testify because I don't trust him. That's what Mr. Brock is saying. He does not trust his colleague.
Point of order.
MP Brock.
Arnold.
Mr. Brock has not had an intervention yet, so I really don't know what Mr. Biddle is saying, but if he's patient enough and my turn eventually comes around, he's going to hear much from Mr. Brock. So I simply add that, okay? Just be patient. You'll hear from me soon, Mr. Biddle.
Thank you. Mr. Biddle?
I think again, hypocritical, Mr. Brock was upset at my points of order, but does the exact same thing. So I guess he can sit in his hypocrisy. But again, I look forward to him talking about how great a colleague Arnold is, but yet that he will use all of that time to prevent him from coming to testify. And this is the standard. I have yet to see a private member's bill where the sponsor doesn't come and testify. We, on S-210, even finally after the filibuster, Mr. Viersen himself came to come and filibuster it. Finally, it broke down, and we had the sponsor from the Senate come and testify to the bill. I think Ms. Vecchio, I believe, was the House of Commons sponsor, was prevented from testifying. Again, the Conservatives preventing one of their members from testifying at committee. Mr. Brock, what I'm talking about is you have interventions in the House of Commons, and I'm taking those and putting them here and into my remarks that, again, you are critical of the Prime Minister, but you're doing the exact same thing. Why don't you call, and I'm sure that you will devote a large percentage of your time to talk about how great Mr. Viersen is and how he should come and testify. And again, Mr. Brock claims, and I believe it to be true, because he spent his career as a prosecutor. He likes to mention it frequently. But yet, and standing up for victims and fighting the good fight, and I believe that. But again, this is the process. I know he's new to this place, newish, but he's been here long enough that sponsors testify. If it's a government bill, the minister testifies, and we go through the process. And why in this one case? What does he not trust Arnold to say? Why doesn't Mr. Barlow trust him? Why doesn't Mr. Van Popta trust him? Why doesn't Mr. Chambers trust him? I know Mr. Barlow just got here, but to be fair to Mr. Barlow,
To know him is to trust him.
it's free Arnold Viersen. Where is he? Why the lack of trust? Is he even in the city? Again, let's call him, and perhaps I can move on unanimous consent if we want to get this going quickly. Move to call Mr. Viersen this afternoon as a witness in this study after votes this afternoon.
Okay. I have a question here for unanimous consent.
No.
Okay, I hear from my left side no. But for the record, we have requested, the clerk has already requested 3 times by 3 different letters for Mr. Viersen to come, and 2 of them were to come today, but we're still here, so. No, so Mr. Biddle, please continue.
Sharon, it's funny who Mr. Brock got quite upset when I suggested he didn't trust Mr. Viersen, and he was the quickest to jump to say no to expediting this study and having Mr. Viersen come this afternoon. So much for standing up for victims. So much for standing up for this legislation, which, again, didn't do any of the things that Mr. Couric talked about in his 2 hours. Where's that urgency? As we look to the end of the table, an empty end of the table, if he's proud of this legislation, he should come and testify. I think he is proud of the legislation. I take him at his word. I don't think his colleagues are proud of him. And I think his colleagues, Mr. Brock especially, are embarrassed by him. They don't want him to come. They don't want him to appear. They're scared of what he'll have to say. And it's truly shameful. If you don't trust, your colleagues, why not have them come and testify? It's embarrassing, it's shameful, and it speaks volumes in terms of what you think of your colleague, Mr. Viersen. I think this legislation deserves to be debated. It deserves to be debated quickly. Mr. Brock does not want it debated today. They just want it to go without study, which is worrisome. If this is as powerful as Mr. Couric says it is, this should be a quick study and on to the next thing. He is correct, it passed unanimously in the House. But I don't know if Mr. Brock is under orders from the leader's office. Maybe he trusts Mr. Viersen and his leader's office doesn't trust Mr. Viersen. But we're spending hours preventing him from testifying. Mr. Brock just denied unanimous consent to have him come and testify. It's truly shameful and hypocritical of a party that pretends to stand up for victims, but when the time comes to actually stand up for them, they are absent. Thank you, Madam
Point of
Chair.
order, Mrs. Chair.
Mr. Chambers, yes?
Yeah,
I'm not sure if
there's
they
no
can
more
see
empty
you where
sides
you're
on the
sitting.
table. Just want to make sure that's clear.
Sorry, say that again?
There's no more empty sides at the table for my colleague, Mr. Biddle.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood what you said, but, okay. MP Van Popta, please.
Madame la Présidente, juste un
Okay,
point.
and
Yes, Mr. Fortin. I don't want to interrupt my colleague, Mr. Popta, but before he begins, would it be possible to reread the motion that we are currently working on? Yes, absolutely. So the motion is the following, and I can read it in both official languages. That the committee ask for an extension of 30 days for the period study Bill C-270.
an extension of 30 sitting days to the period of committee consideration of Bill C-270.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Moi, dans les
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think under the circumstances, I would ask for a vote on the motion.
Quelques noms ici dans la liste.
I hear some no's here, Mr. Van Popta and Mr. Brock. So we can't ask for the vote if there are members who wish to take the floor. Okay, so I would ask you to add my name on after Mr. Brock's, and I will make the request at that time. Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so we'll come back with Mr. Van Popta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for rereading the motion. I was getting somewhat confused because Mr. Biddle kept referring to Mr. Bierson. I didn't think that name even appeared in the motion that is before us today, that is to extend for 30 days. I'd expressed before my frustration in us not proceeding with this study. We had some time. We should have called witnesses. I understand that the list of witnesses has been provided to the chair some time ago, and I had hoped that witnesses on this study would appear earlier this week, and I had hoped again that they would appear today, but the Liberals are clearly playing games. For some reason or another, they don't want to hear what these witnesses have to say. They only want to hear what Mr. Bierson has to say, and I find that very frustrating. But I ask myself, why do we even need a 30-day extension to a 60-day rule? And I think it would be useful just to read from Bosque and Gagnon what they say about the 60 days, just so that we have it clear and in front of us. With regard to private members' bills, the standing orders provide that the committee to which they are referred have 60 sitting days from the date of the order of reference to conclude their consideration of the bill and report the bill to the House with or without amendments, present a report recommending not to proceed with the bill, or to present a request for 30 days extension. So I believe that that's the rule that we're up against. So I did the math. The bill came before us, was referred to us from the House after second reading vote on May 8th. So that's almost 6 months ago. Surely we could have had the time to have the study done by then. And so I looked through the schedule of events as to what this committee has been doing all this time to see why it could not have come to us before, and why it is now a crisis that we need to get a 30-day extension. Now, at the time of May 8th, there were two important studies in front of this committee. One was on anti-Semitism, one was on Islamophobia. We agreed those were two important studies, and the Conservative members of this committee were very interested in studying those two reports. So this is what happened. On May 9th, the committee studied anti-Semitism. We had witnesses come before us. On May 23rd, again, anti-Semitism study, and we had witnesses come before us. And then a repeat of that on Monday, May 27th, anti-Semitism witnesses. And I recall those meetings very well. They were interesting. It was good to hear different perspectives. I was very encouraged by the bravery with which these witnesses appeared and explained to us what was going on, particularly on campuses. I thought those three meetings were very educational, certainly for me. And then on June 3rd, we switched over to the Islamophobia study. Again, we had witnesses appear before us on that day.
Point of order.
Yes, point of order.
This is completely irrelevant to the matter in question. Again, like Mr. Van Popta is talking about 6 months for Mr. Bierson to appear. Maybe he can discuss why he's not appearing within those 6 months is more reasonable and more in line of what we're discussing.
On the same point of order, Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Brock.
It is absolutely 100% relevant to the only motion that is before this committee, which has absolutely nothing to do with my colleague Arnold Bierson, but rather extending this study by 30 days. And it's relevant that Mr. Van Popta is going through the history by which we found ourselves in a position to study this particular bill, which has been at committee now for close to 6 months.
Mr. Van Popta, continue. And by the way, the clerk also has the record of the appearances that we've had. I know it sounds 6 months, but we obviously broke in June and did not return till the third week of September. Yes.
We'll get through. So I'm very happy that the clerk also has it in front of him, and I'm sure that he will point out if and when I am wrong. But I think I'm pretty accurate in what's going on. So I was saying that we started the Islamophobia study on June 3rd. Now, keeping in mind that the private members bill C-270 had been with us for almost a month by then already. And I'm just setting the framework to come to an understanding as to why, after 6 months, it is now becoming a crisis that we need to deal with this private members bill. So on June 3rd, we had witnesses appear before us on the Islamophobia study. And then later that week, on Thursday, June 6th, again, we had witnesses appear before us on the Islamophobia study. And then again, the following week, on Monday, June 10th, we had witnesses come here on the Islamophobia study. I remember those meetings well. And again, I was impressed with the testimony, the courage with which the witnesses came to us to give testimony was heartfelt. Stories that we were receiving, and I knew that they were going to be good reports coming out of this, out of these two studies. And on June 13th, I believe that was the last day that we had witnesses come to us on the anti-Semitism study. So we were sort of going back and forth. And then on and I believe on June 13th, we also gave instructions. I don't know if we had witnesses, but we took time to give instructions to the analysts as to what we thought was important to put into the report on anti-Semitism. And then on June 17th, the next week, same thing with the Islamophobia study. We had all gone through the witness testimony, at least I did, over the weekend, read the testimony, and highlighted what I thought was important to be put into the report. And I remember at the time that we told the analysts, you are very good at what you do, highly educated people, great drafters. Please go ahead and go through all the testimony, put the report together as best you can, and including the recommendations. I've been on other committees where the members of the committee actually spend time writing the recommendations themselves and then submitting it to the analyst. And the analysts, I have seen, have had a hard time, on the one hand, paying respect to the drafter of the recommendations, and on the other hand, trying to make the report coherent as though it was written by one person. So I was very happy that the other committee members agreed that we would just give free rein to our analysts to work on the two reports, including writing the recommendations, and to work on that over the summer, present it to us in September. And indeed, that is what happened. And of course, those meetings are in camera when we're reviewing the reports. So there's only so much I can say about what happened at those committees. But I would just say this, that as I expected, the reports came back very well written, very thorough. I remember going through them, sitting in the airplane on the way here with my highlighter and my pen. I thought, I might have said this one slightly differently, or I might have done it that way, or I might have put the paragraphs in a slightly different order. But in the end, I thought, it's like, we had delegated this task to our analysts. They did a good job, and I want to respect them. And Madam Chair, at that time, I could have accepted at least the narrative part of each of those reports as they were written, and then with my committee members go into the recommendations and see if I thought that there was probably going to be room there for some disagreement, for some debate, for some refining. In my opinion, that would have been one 2-hour meeting on each report. But that's not what happened. On September 23rd, we had set aside an in-camera meeting on the Islamophobia study. Later that week, on Thursday, September 26th, we had a 2-hour meeting in camera on reviewing the first draft of the anti-Semitism report. On Thursday, October 10th, we had a second 2-hour in-camera meeting on reviewing another draft of the Islamophobia report. On Monday, October 21st, we had a third meeting, 2-hour in-camera meeting debating the drafting of the report. Thursday, October 24th, we had
Point of order.
Count here. I believe that is a third meeting.
Mr. Van Popta, one moment. Mr. Biddle, please.
Again, this is
A
not
point of
relevant.
order.
Reading the agenda of the minutes of the committee is not relevant to the study of why Mr. Vierson refuses to come and why over the 6 months he refuses to attend.
So, Mr. Bartle? No.
That's okay.
Okay. Mr. Keurig?
Thank you. Very, very glad to be back to this. But on that point of order, Madam Chair, it is certainly, while I'm sure you appreciate the feedback that Mr. Biddle is providing to you about relevance, it is not up to to him or the government to determine what is associated with relevance of this committee. But I would, however, note that the motion before us, put forward by Mr. Maloney, is directly related to the extending the study of the meeting. So I would suggest that Mr. Van Popta's intervention is not only relevant but actually prescient to the specifics of with precision to the specifics of the motion that is being discussed.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for this. What I'm going to do now is suspend. We will return post votes at 3:30 today. Suspend.